3 Chapter M. My phone buzzed with a notification from the security cameras. Person detected. Backyard. I expected a raccoon, maybe a deer, but the clip showed a man standing in the middle of my snow-covered yard, under the yellow spill of the streetlight, facing my kitchen window like he was waiting for someone to answer. He wasn't moving at all. No pacing, no shifting, no hunching against the cold, just a straight, motionless silhouette while snow gathered on his shoulders. I rewound the footage and felt my throat tighten when I saw he hadn't just appeared. He'd walked into frame at 1158p. Stopped under the light and stayed there. The camera had sent earlier alerts that I'd slept through. That meant he'd been in my yard for more than 3 hours, already just standing there in the storm, staring at a house full of sleeping people. I slid out of bed, pulled the curtain back a finger's width, and saw him with my own eyes in the exact same spot. The part that made my stomach drop wasn't that he was there. It was that his head was already angled up toward the window, as if he'd heard the fabric move. We'd moved into the house 2 weeks earlier, a quiet cul-de-sac where the loudest night sound was usually a plow scraping ice. Our neighbor in the grey house had introduced himself on day 1. Mark, late 40s, polite smile that never reached his eyes, and he'd stared at my face while he talked like he was committing it to memory. I turned on the backyard floodlights. Harsh white light snapped on, and the man didn't flinch. He didn't lift an arm to shield his eyes. He didn't even seem to breathe. I woke my wife, and she went cold the moment she saw the live feed. I called 911 and tried to sound reasonable. Unknown person in my backyard, not leaving, not responding to light. The dispatcher told us to stay inside and that officers were on the way. While we waited, I kept expecting the man to do something normal, walk away look, annoyed, wave anything that would make him a person with a reason. Instead, he stayed, and the longer he stayed, the more the stillness stopped feeling like waiting and started feeling like practice. Every few minutes, my phone would buzz with another person detected alert, even though he hadn't moved. Like the camera system was growing, increasingly panicked that a human body could be that quiet for that long. At 324, my wife whispered that she thought he was closer. I checked the feed and realized she was right. Not closer in the way you'd expect with visible steps, but closer as if he'd been slid forward across the snow. The distance between him and the back door was smaller, yet the snow around him was still smooth and untouched. Then the doorbell camera chimed. Motion at the front door. I switched views and felt my chest tighten, because he was there now, standing on my porch, directly under the lens, looking up as if he knew where it was. This time the camera caught enough detail to show a pale face under a dark hat, mouth pressed into a line, eyes lost in shadow. He raised one gloved hand and set it flat against the door. Not a knock, not a push, just contact, like he was feeling the warmth through the wood. My wife whispered that we should get a gun, and I hated how quickly that sounded like a sensible thought. The dispatcher kept repeating, "Do not open the door. Do not engage." I stood in the hallway with a kitchen knife I didn't believe would help, listening for a sound that never came. No footsteps, no breathing, no scratching at the lock. Just the soft tick of the thermostat and the steady glow of the porch light through the peephole. At 331, the porch feed stuttered for a heartbeat, like the Wi-Fi hiccuped. When the picture stabilized, the porch was empty. I checked the backyard camera. Empty, too. No running figure, no retreating shadow, nothing but smooth white snow, as if no one had ever stepped there. That should have been relief. It felt worse. It felt like the proof had been erased while we were still watching. Headlights finally swept across the street, and 2 officers came in calm in a way that made me feel foolish, until I remembered what I'd seen. I showed them the clips. One officer's expression tightened for a second at the sight of the motionless man, but when they checked the yard with flashlights, they found exactly what I'd already noticed. No tracks. Not a single footprint, leading in or out. The officer crouched, ran a glove over the untouched powder, then pointed to a faint dark circle under the streetlight. Snow slightly melted, pressed down as if something heavy had stood there long enough to warm it. That's something, he admitted, and I could hear how much he didn't want to say more. They took a report and told us to call back if the person returned. After they left, I walked to the front door and stared at the spot where the man's hand had been. In the right angle of light, I could see it a full palm print fogged into the varnish, as if the glove had been wet, as if his hand had been sweating in the cold. We didn't sleep after that. We sat on the couch until dawn, cycling through camera views like it was a ritual. Around 7, I watched our neighbor Mark step out of his front door with a mug of coffee stretch, like he'd had a perfect night, and wave across the street. Something about the way he held himself, the same unnatural stillness, the same patient posture made my mouth taste like metal. I went outside because I refused to let my home become a cage. "You were in my yard last night," I called. Mark's smile stayed in place. "Was I?" he said, like it was an interesting rumor. "The police came," I said. "They couldn't find tracks." Mark took a slow sip and looked at the fresh snow between our houses. "Snow covers a lot," he said. "Sometimes things happen and you can't prove them." Then he tapped his temple once and added almost gently, "New house nerves. That'll pass." I stood there staring at him, waiting for denial, anger, anything human. He just watched me with the same calm attention he'd given my kitchen window. When I turned back toward my porch, my phone buzzed again. Person detected. Backyard. I looked down. The live feed showed an empty yard. No man, no movement. Yet the camera had drawn its bright box in the exact center of the frame, under the streetlight, neatly outlining nothing at all, as if the system could still see him standing. There, even when my eyes could not. The next night I told myself I was overreacting, and left the floodlights off just to prove I could. Untitled Chapter. The notification returned the same words, the same calm font. Person detected. Backyard. I didn't even open the clip at first. I just stared at the screen, waiting for my hands to stop shaking. When I finally looked, the yard was empty again, but the box hovered under the streetlight, like a target painted on the snow. Then my phone buzzed a second time. Motion detected. Street. Camera. I switched to the front view and saw Mark's living room window across the cul-de-sac dark, except for the faint blue glow of a television. He was standing behind his blinds, perfectly still, the slats parted just enough for one eye to show, and that eye was aimed straight at my house like he'd been waiting for me to look back. I stood frozen in my hallway watching him watch me, and I understood with sick certainty that this wasn't a one-night scare. It was a routine. My phone buzzed again in my palm, and before I even looked, I knew it would be the same calm words, person detected. If you've never had a snowman stare into your bedroom at 3 a.m., you probably think that sentence is a joke. I wish it were. Mark the neighbor in the grey house built it on a Saturday in early January. Most people in our cul-de-sac made messy, friendly snowmen with crooked carrot noses. Mark's looked engineered free perfect spheres packed tight and smoothed flat branch arms trimmed to the same length. A black knit cap set dead center on top. He didn't give it a smile. He didn't even give it eyes. He just stood back with his hands in his pockets and studied it like it was a project. What bothered me was where he put it. Not near his porch. Not by the sidewalk where kids would pose for photos. He placed it in the one spot that lined up with our second floor window, the one my wife and I slept behind, so that the snowman's blank head faced our house like a sentry. That first night, I woke up around 2:30 for no reason at all, and glanced out the window. The streetlight turned the snow into a pale sheet of paper, and the snowman was a dark punctuation mark in the middle of it. The cap brim angled toward us. I told myself it only looked like it was watching because I was looking at it, and I rolled over. 2 nights later, my phone buzzed at 3:12 a.m. with a camera alert. Motion detected. Front yard. I opened the feed and saw Mark out there in the falling snow wearing a white hooded coverall that blended into the drift so well that for a second he looked like a glitch in the night vision. He wasn't shoveling. He wasn't salting. He was standing beside the snowman, smoothing the head with slow strokes, then stepping back and facing our house, in the same still posture I'd seen him hold when he watched me talk. My wife leaned over my shoulder and whispered, "Why is he doing that?" I didn't answer because the answer felt too ugly to say. By the time I went downstairs and peeked through the curtain, Mark was gone. The snowman remained in the streetlight, blank and patient. After that, I started noticing small changes I couldn't explain. Cap brim, lower. Some mornings, branch arms subtly repositioned. Yet the snowman always looked freshly maintained. On Friday, the temperature dropped hard. The snow turned crisp and loud underfoot, and the world felt sealed inside glass. A doi cinci zeci. She opt a m. My phone buzzed again. Motion detected. Front yard. I opened the live feed and my stomach tightened because the snowman finally had eyes. 2 dark circles beneath the cap, brim glossy and wet looking in the infrared set, too deep for coal. I stared, trying to force a normal explanation into place. Buttons, shadows, leaves, until the eyes shifted upward by a fraction. Then they closed and opened again in a slow, deliberate blink. My throat locked. I didn't scream. I didn't move. I just watched the feed with both hands around my phone like it was the only solid thing in the room. Another alert popped up. Motion detected. Side yard. I switched cameras and saw a white shape sliding along the shadow of our house, keeping close to the wall the way a person does when they don't want to be seen. He stopped beneath our bedroom window and went perfectly still, head tilted up as if listening through the glass. My wife woke to my whisper and covered her mouth when she saw the screen. I called 911, and my voice came out thin and unreal as I explained that someone was outside and that my neighbor's snowman had just blinked. The dispatcher paused, the kind of pause that tells you they're deciding whether you're drunk. But when I said the figure was under our window and not leaving her tone sharpened, stay inside. Do not confront. Officers are on the way. We turned on every light in the house. The figure under the window did not run. The snowman did not fall apart. Then the doorbell camera chimed. Motion at the front door. Mark was on our porch, in his dark coat, smiling up at the lens, like a friendly neighbor who'd happened to be awake. He lifted one hand in a slow wave and leaned close enough that the microphone caught his voice, soft and cheerful. Everything okay over there? He asked. Your lights popped on. Thought you might need help. The dispatcher told me to ignore him. I did, but I couldn't stop watching. Mark stepped off the porch and walked into his own yard, stopping beside the snowman. He stood shoulder to shoulder with it, then reached up and tugged the cap brim down. The eyes disappeared into shadow. The snowman went blank again. Headlights swung into the cul-de-sac, washing the snow in blue and red. Mark didn't run. He just turned and raised his hands as if he were the one surprised by all the commotion. The officers got out and spoke to him, then swept flashlights across his yard. From my upstairs window I watched them circle the snowman, shine light across its smooth surface, and find nothing. No footprints leading to our window either. The fresh powder around our foundation looked untouched, and I felt myself starting to unravel because I knew what I'd seen, and the evidence was dissolving in front of professionals. One officer came to our door. I let him in and showed him the clip of the blink. He watched it twice, jaw tightening, then said carefully, This could be a shadow effect with the cap. I pointed at the side yard feed. That's not a shadow, I said. He agreed, but he couldn't conjure tracks that weren't there. He asked if we could speak to Mark. I told him Mark was the problem. The officer went back outside anyway. From the camera I watched Mark talk with calm hands, smiling, nodding, gesturing toward his house like a man explaining a misunderstanding. The officers eventually left with polite warnings about calling again if someone returned. Mark remained in his yard after their headlights faded, alone with the snowman under the streetlight. He didn't go inside right away. He stood there for a long time, looking at our house as if he was disappointed the performance had been interrupted. At sunrise, when the street was busy enough to feel safe, I walked over and tore the snowman apart with my bare hands. The cold burned, but I didn't care. I ripped away the smooth outer layer and found what had made it look so perfect. A hollow cavity inside the head, reinforced with a plastic bucket and duct tape, the kind used to keep snow from collapsing. 2 small holes had been punched through the front at eye level, edged with black fabric like a mask. It wasn't decoration. It was a viewing port. At the bottom of the cavity, tucked against the bucket, was a flattened thermal blanket and an empty hand warmer packet. Someone had been inside that snowman, breathing, watching, blinking. I stood there in Mark's yard with icy snow melting down my wrists, and behind me I heard his front door open. "Careful," Mark said calmly, as if I'd stepped on his flowers. "You'll ruin it." I turned and he was on his porch, in his robe, coffee in hand, smiling like we were discussing lawn care. His eyes flicked to the torn snowman, then back to my face, and the smile widened. "Told you," he said softly. "Snow covers a lot." That night, at 3:01 a.m., my phone buzzed again. Person detected. Front yard. I opened the feed and saw an empty yard. No snowman, no Mark, no movement. Just the bright motion box floating in the streetlight, perfectly framed at the height of a man's eyes. I kept the feed open until sunrise, waiting for the next blink. At 3:03 a.m., I woke up because my bedroom went from black to grey, like someone had lifted a dimmer somewhere in the house. I checked my phone and saw a new notification from the smart bulb app, living room light on. I hadn't touched it, neither had my wife. I slid out of bed barefoot, heart punching at my ribs, and crept to the top of the stairs. Downstairs was dark, except for the faint spill of light under the living room door, a thin line like a mouth that refused to close. I pushed the door open and found the lamp by the couch glowing at its lowest setting, warm and calm, as if someone had turned it on to read. The TV was off. The front door was locked. The windows were latched. I stood in the quiet, listening for the sound you always pray for. In moments like that, the someone else's breathing, and heard nothing but the refrigerator hum and the dry tick of the heater. I turned the lamp off in the app and watched it obey. The room went black again. I went back to bed and told myself it was a glitch, a power flicker, anything. Then my phone buzzed again. Porch camera motion. I opened the live feed and saw my neighbor, Mark, in the grey house, standing on his porch, across the cul-de-sac coat, buttoned up hands at his sides, staring straight at my front window. He wasn't holding a phone. He wasn't smoking. He was just there, under his porch light, with snow falling around him like static. As I watched the light behind him, his living room lamp clicked on the exact same soft level as mine had been. A second later, my living room lamp turned itself on again. Not bright, not random. Identical. I felt a cold line slide down my spine. I turned my lamp off. Across the street, his lamp went off. I turned mine on. His came on. It was so perfectly timed that it didn't feel like reaction. It felt like mirroring, like he'd rehearsed it, like he'd been waiting for me to notice the pattern. I forced myself to move slowly, to make my body act normal, even though my thoughts were sprinting. I walked into the kitchen and flipped on the overhead light. On the porch feed, I saw a pale rectangle bloom in Mark's upstairs window, the same position as his kitchen, like his overhead had turned on too. I turned mine off. His went off. I opened the blinds a few inches. Across the street, his blinds opened a few inches. My hands started to shake. I wasn't playing a game with a neighbor. I was testing whether someone had access to my house. I checked the smart home app history and saw every change logged from a device labeled primary controller, my phone with my authentication token, which meant either my account had been compromised or someone's device had been paired to my network, or I didn't want to finish the thought. My wife appeared in the hallway, eyes half open, whispering, "What are you doing?" I held up the phone so she could see Mark's still figure. Her face drained, and she did what I couldn't. She backed away from the windows. I called the non-emergency line first because I didn't have a gun, because I didn't have proof, because I could hear how insane it would sound out loud. "My neighbor is matching my lights," I said, and hated myself the moment the words left my mouth. The operator asked if he'd threatened me. I said no. Asked if he'd trespassed. I said not that I knew. She gave me the kind of careful advice you give someone you assume is anxious. Close your blinds, document it, call back if he approaches. I hung up and felt anger cut through the fear. Fine. I would document. I positioned my phone against a glass on the table, set it to record video of the porch feed, and then I did something childish. I waved at Mark through the window. On the feed, he lifted his hand and waved back perfectly in sync, like my movement had tugged him on a string. Then he pointed at his own eyes, with 2 fingers, and slowly pointed them toward my house. I felt my mouth go dry. I turned away from the window and walked into the interior hallway, where there were no cameras, no glass, nothing that gave a line of sight. I stood there in the darkest center of my home and held my breath. My phone buzzed. Living room, light off. I hadn't touched it. I hadn't even been in the room. I rushed back and saw the lamp was dark. Across the cul-de-sac, Mark's lamp was still on. He wasn't mirroring me now. He was leading. I opened the app and turned my lamp on. Nothing happened. The toggle slid back. Offline. Every smart device in my house went grey, one by one like dying stars. Thermostat, disconnected. Cameras disconnected. Doorbell, disconnected. And in the porch camera feed, the only thing still streaming because it cached locally, Mark's porch light clicked off. For a second the video went grainy, night vision straining. Mark didn't disappear. He simply became a darker shape in the dark, still facing my window. Then a new shape appeared behind him in his doorway, lit faintly by the blue glow of a TV inside. It was me, or something wearing my height and posture. A figure stepped up behind him and lifted a hand, placing it on Mark's shoulder like an owner calming a dog. I stared so hard, my eyes watered. The figure turned its head toward the camera, and in the infrared I caught a white oval of a face blank, smooth, no features, and then it raised one finger to where its mouth should have been. My wife grabbed my arm and hissed that the front door just clicked. We both froze. The house was silent, but I heard something I couldn't explain. The faint, soft tap of fingernails on glass, as if someone were tracing the edge of a window pane from the outside. Tap, tap, tap. It moved along the front of the house with patient precision checking. Learning. I realized then that the mirroring had never been about lights. It was about training me to respond, to show patterns, to confirm which window I checked first, to find the line that made me move. I dragged my wife into the bathroom, the only room with a solid door and no windows, and I locked it. My phone had no signal, no Wi-Fi, just the dull, useless glow of a screen. In the darkness, I heard the tap stop at the bathroom window. Then, nothing for a long moment. And then from the other side of the wall, a slow, deliberate switch flipped in the hallway. The light came on. Not the bathroom light. The hall light, outside. As if someone had found the manual breaker and decided they didn't need the app anymore. My wife started to cry without sound. I pressed my ear to the door and listened. On the tile floor, my phone buzzed one final time before it died. Front camera motion. I didn't need to see it. In the mirror above the sink, in the thin crack under the bathroom door, I could see the shadow of someone standing perfectly still in the hallway, facing our door, waiting for us to make the next move, so he could match it. The shadow didn't move. The hall light clicked off, and a soft knock followed 3 taps on the bathroom door, perfectly spaced. Then a whisper through the wood in a voice that sounded like mine after a long, cold, "I see you." My phone, dead a moment ago, flashed once as if it had saved a final breath, and a cached porch clip opened by itself. Mark was still across the street, staring, his hand lifted in a slow wave. In the reflection of my own front window, I saw a second wave from inside my living room. Someone standing in the dark, where the lamp should have been matching him exactly. Adui patruzej shushaptea. The sound that woke me wasn't a scream or a crash. It was a shovel. Not the quick scrape of someone clearing a path, but the slow, heavy rhythm of metal biting frozen earth. Funk, drag, funk, drag. I lay still and listened until the pattern convinced me it wasn't my imagination. The noise was coming from the side yard, close enough that the vibrations seemed to travel through the studs. I opened the camera app and pulled up the side fence view. The night vision image showed our property line, the narrow strip between my house and Mark's, lit by a single motion light that had somehow turned on without triggering an alert. Mark was out there in boots and a thick coat, digging. He wasn't shoveling snow. He'd already cleared. It piled into neat ridges like he was setting a stage, and now he was carving into the ground itself, hacking at the frozen layer until the shovel broke through with a dark, satisfying plunge. He worked with the calm patience of someone who knew exactly how deep he needed to go. He didn't look around. He didn't pause to rest. Every few minutes he would stop, straighten his back, and stare at my wall as if checking whether I was watching. I backed away from the window anyway, then hated myself for doing it. My wife asked what was wrong, and I showed her the feed. The color left her face. "Call someone," she whispered. "Call the police." I did, and the dispatcher asked the same questions as before. "Is he on your property? Is he threatening you? Do you feel unsafe?" I said yes to the last one because I did. Because a man digging a hole in the middle of a winter night isn't normal, and because my gut recognized intention, even when my brain tried to sand it down. While I waited for officers, I watched Mark keep digging. The hole grew longer than it was wide, a rectangle, a grave shape, a person shape. At 3:06, he set the shovel down and climbed into the hole with careful steps, as if he didn't want to disturb the edges. For a few seconds, the camera saw only his shoulders and hat. Then his head tilted up and he looked straight toward my camera lens, like he'd always known where it was. He smiled once small and private, then ducked down out of sight. The motion light stayed on. The hole stayed open. Mark disappeared into the ground. My wife pulled me away from the screen. "Do not go out there," she said. "The kind of command you give when you can feel your life splitting into before and after." I didn't plan to, but when the shovel started again from inside the hole, scraping against something that didn't sound like dirt, I almost lost my mind. It was a different noise now, a hollow clack, the sound of metal against wood or concrete. Mark was hitting something buried, something already there. Headlights finally swung into the cul-de-sac, and 2 officers walked up my driveway with flashlights. I let them in, talking too fast, pointing at the feed. They watched Mark's yard for a long moment without saying anything. One officer's jaw tightened. "Stay inside," he said, and they went around the side gate. I watched through the camera as their beams cut across the snow and found the open rectangle of earth. The officers called out, "Sir, step out of the hole." No response. They moved closer, careful of the slick ground. One officer peered down and immediately stepped back, like he'd seen a snake. Then he did something that made my stomach drop. He raised his radio and said very calmly, "We need another unit and a supervisor." From my place behind glass, I couldn't see what he saw inside the hole. I could only see the way both officers repositioned, spacing themselves as if they were bracing for something to come up. After a minute, Mark's head appeared at the edge slowly, like a swimmer, breaking the surface. His face was smeared with dark soil, and he looked annoyed, not scared. "What is this?" he asked, like the officers were the ones trespassing. "Step out, sir," the officer repeated. "Hands where we can see them." Mark complied with theatrical patience, climbing out, brushing his gloves together, never looking at the hole again. The officers asked him why he was digging at this hour. Mark nodded toward his house. "Frozen pipe," he said. "I'm trying to access the line." The officer glanced at the hole, too big, too far from the foundation, too cleanly shaped to be about plumbing, and didn't buy it. "Mind if we take a look?" the officer asked. Mark's smile returned. "It's my yard. It wasn't illegal to dig in your own yard. That was the problem." The officers shined their lights into the hole anyway. One of them swore under his breath. Mark turned his head slightly toward my house, toward my camera, and I felt like the swear word was meant for me. A few minutes later, one officer came back to my door. He asked if I'd ever noticed an old structure on the property line. A septic tank, a storm shelter, anything. I told him no. He said carefully that the hole had opened into something underneath an empty concrete cavity with a wooden hatch, like an old access point. And inside that cavity there were fresh boot prints in dust. Not Mark's prints. Fresh ones, leading toward the line between our houses. He told me they couldn't go into Mark's property further without cause. He told me to keep my doors locked. Then he left, and the units drove away, their lights shrinking until the street returned to a quiet that felt staged. On the side yard feed, Mark stood alone again beside the open hole. He stared at it for a long time, then looked up at my wall. He lifted his hand and made a slow, twisting motion like turning a key. Downstairs in my kitchen, I heard a soft metallic click from somewhere I couldn't see, followed by the faint hiss of air moving through a space that wasn't supposed to exist. My wife asked what that sound was, and I lied and said it was the heater. Then I took a flashlight to the basement, because I couldn't unhear the idea of a key turning. The air down there smelled wrong, sharp and damp, like freshly opened soil. Behind a stack of moving boxes, I found a vent cover I didn't remember installing, set low near the floor, its screws bright and new. When I touched it, I felt a draft. I backed the screws out, eased the cover away, and aimed my light into a narrow gap framed in rough wood. It wasn't part of the foundation. It was a crawl space that shouldn't exist, cut, clean, and recent. Along the dirt wall inside, someone had stapled a strip of our beige living room carpet like padding. 10 feet in the beam caught a small camera, one of those baby monitors, mounted on a stake, and aimed upward toward my floor joists. Toward our bedroom. I stood there, trying to make my brain refuse it, and then from deeper in the tunnel, I heard a soft scrape, the sound of a boot shifting on dirt. Close. Waiting. I slammed the cover back on, shoved the boxes into place with shaking hands, and dragged the shelving unit back in front of it. Upstairs, my wife asked what I found. I told her to grab the car keys. At 3, 4, 6, 1, A. M. The side yard camera pinged again. Mark was filling the hole, tamping snow over it until the yard looked untouched. By morning there was no rectangle, no disturbed earth, just fresh, white. But in our basement behind the shelves, a thin hairline crack had appeared in the concrete, straight as a ruler, outlining a man-sized rectangle, as if someone had started cutting from the inside out. Across the street, Mark watched us from his window, smiling. At 3 Nor. M. I heard a man's voice outside, clear as if someone had opened a window, and for one confused second I thought it was a late-night phone call coming through a speaker. Then I realized the sound was coming from my driveway. Not the street. Not Mark's yard. Mine. I rolled out of bed and went to the front window with the curtains still closed, the way you do when you already know you shouldn't look. The Porch camera app opened on my phone, and the live feed showed my driveway washed in pale infrared and falling snow. Mark stood near the driver's side of my car, hands in his coat, pockets head, angled slightly like he was listening. His breath didn't plume. He looked too comfortable for the cold, like the cold belonged to him. And he was talking. He wasn't muttering to himself either. He was speaking in that calm, polite, neighbor voice you use when you're trying to sound normal. No, not tonight, he said, pausing after, as if waiting for a reply. He's still here. Another pause. He nodded once. Had nothing. I know. But he checks the cameras now. I felt my stomach harden. The driveway was empty. No second person. No car idling. No silhouette in the snow. Just Mark standing in my property line. Shadow having a conversation with the air as if it could answer back. My wife whispered from behind me, asking what I was doing, and I motioned for silence because I suddenly had the irrational fear that Mark could hear the sound of our breathing through the glass. Mark stepped forward close enough to my car that the camera caught a sharper view of his face. He leaned slightly toward the space beside him, like someone leaning in to hear a friend over loud music. "Did you bring it?" he asked, softly. He waited. Then he smiled, a small pleased curl that made his face look younger and meaner at the same time. "Good," he said. "Put it where he'll find it." My throat went tight, and I did something I regretted instantly. I tapped the microphone icon on the camera feed, the little talk button that lets you speak through the doorbell. I didn't plan words. I just wanted to disrupt him, to prove he was a human being trespassing, and not a nightmare that could rewrite my reality. The speaker crackled, and my voice came out thin and high through the outside camera. "Mark," I said. "What are you doing?" Mark didn't jump. He didn't spin around, guilty. He turned his head slowly toward my front door, like he'd been expecting me to speak. He raised one finger, not at me, but at the empty space beside him, and made a gentle shushing motion. Then he said into the air at his shoulder, "See, he talks when he's scared." I felt my face go cold. He was narrating me like I was a case study. Then he looked directly at the camera lens, not at my house, not at my window, but at the black dot that held the microphone, and he spoke with the calm certainty of someone who knew exactly where I stood upstairs. "Sorry," he said, smiling faintly. "Didn't mean to wake you." I didn't answer. I couldn't. The camera audio was still open and my wife's hand gripped my arm, hard enough to hurt. Mark tilted his head again, as if he'd heard something the camera couldn't. He nodded once, then stepped backward, into the center of my driveway, careful, deliberate, like he was positioning himself on a mark. "Okay," he said quietly. "Do it." He stared down at the snow as if watching something approach, and I held my breath, waiting to see footprints, appear, to see a second shadow bloom beside him, to see anything that made sense. Nothing moved. Mark's mouth twitched, like he was listening to a whisper, and his eyes tracked something invisible, crossing my driveway toward my front steps. His gaze followed it so naturally that my brain tried to force an image into the empty space. A person in a white hooded suit, a shape crouched low, a body that didn't reflect infrared. Mark's expression softened in a way that made my skin crawl like affection. "Good," he said, again barely audible. "Right there." Then he lifted his hand and pointed at my porch, at the exact spot under the camera where packages usually sat. He pointed as if he could see something being placed there. A second later, the doorbell camera flagged motion, the little square tracking something that wasn't visible. The system drew a box around empty air, as if the software had found a person-shaped void. The alert text flashed, "Person detected," but the porch was empty on the screen. My heart slammed so hard I felt it in my teeth. Mark lowered his hand and spoke more firmly, like giving final instructions. "Now go," he said. "Don't be seen." He watched the empty space move away from the porch. Then he turned back toward my car and brushed his glove across the driver's side window, slow and intimate, like he was wiping away a thought. I couldn't stop myself. I pulled the curtain back a fraction and stared down at him with my own eyes. He looked up immediately, as if the fabric made a sound only he could hear, and I saw the faintest glint of something pale in his gaze, something that said he wasn't surprised by being watched, because watching was the whole point. He nodded once, like a teacher, acknowledging a student finally paying attention, then walked off my driveway and back toward his own house without hurrying. The moment he crossed the edge of my yard, the night went silent again. No voice, no conversation, just snow falling and the distant hum of a highway. I waited a full minute, then another, then forced myself downstairs every step, feeling like a betrayal of my own safety instincts. I kept the porch light off. I opened the door, just enough to slip my head out, the cold air hitting my face like a slap, and I looked down at the porch where Mark had pointed. There was nothing. No package. No note. No object at all. But the boards were wet in one small oval patch, as if something warm had rested there long enough to melt snow. Right in the center of that wet patch, pressed into the moisture, was a single shallow impression shaped like the edge of a hand. Not a full print. Just the curve of fingers, like someone had leaned down and steadied themselves while crouching. I backed inside and locked the deadbolt, so hard, it rattled. When I returned to the camera feed, Mark was in his own driveway now, standing under his porch light, looking at his empty street the way he'd looked at my empty driveway. He lifted his hand and waved at someone I couldn't see. Then he turned and went inside. I barely slept. At dawn, I went out again to check the porch in sunlight, hoping the wet patch would have dried into nothing. Instead, I found a small object tucked neatly against the bottom of my doorframe, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. A tiny black plastic microphone, the kind you clip onto a shirt collar, with a thin wire leading to a recorder. No, bigger than a thumb drive. It was new. It was clean. It wasn't mine. My hands shook as I picked it up, and I felt a rush of anger so sharp it almost felt like courage. I plugged it into my laptop, with the reckless determination of someone who needs to know even if it breaks them. A single audio file opened, time-stamped at 3:07 a.m. I hit play and heard my own house. At night, the faint click of the heater, the creak of a floorboard, the soft static of winter air. Then I heard Mark's voice, closer than it should have been, like he'd been standing right beside the recorder. And then I heard the second voice. Low, calm, familiar in a way that made my blood drain from my face. It was my voice, but not the way I sounded speaking. The cadence was wrong, too smooth, too patient, like someone wearing my voice the way a person wears a coat. My voice said softly, "He's awake." Mark replied, "Pleased I know." My voice said, "He watched." Mark answered, "Good." Then my voice, still calm, "Still mine, but not mine," said the words that made my hands go numb on the keyboard. Next, the trash. Two nights after the recorder, I started treating my garbage like evidence, the way you treat something ordinary when it becomes part of a threat. I shredded mail. I tore labels off prescription bottles. I stopped throwing away anything with my name on it, and started keeping a paper bag of sensitive trash in the cabinet, like I was living in a spy movie, except the enemy wasn't a foreign government. It was a man who waved at empty air in my driveway, and knew my sleep schedule better than I did. The first time I caught him photographing my trash, it was so mundane that my brain almost rejected it. I woke at 3:18 a.m. to my phone buzzing, driveway camera motion. I opened the feed and saw Mark crouched beside my garbage cans at the curb, the lid tilted open. He held his phone in one gloved hand, flashlight on, and he was taking pictures like he was documenting a crime scene. Not quick snapshots either. He moved, slowly, lifting items one by one, an empty cereal box, a crumpled receipt, a plastic container, and laying them flat on the snow to photograph from above. He adjusted angles. He zoomed. He took multiple shots of the same object as if he needed the text perfectly legible. Then he put everything back neatly and closed the lid like a respectful neighbor who'd borrowed a tool and returned it. I stared at the screen with a horrible clarity. He wasn't looking for food scraps. He was building a map of my life out of what I threw away. My wife whispered, "Call the police," and I did, and I hated the tone of my own voice, because even I could hear how pathetic it sounded. "He's going through my trash," I said. The officer on the phone asked if he'd damaged anything, if he'd stolen anything, if I'd confronted him. I said no. He told me to document it, and said something about local ordinances and property lines, and how trash at the curb could be considered public in some places. Public. That word clanged in my head like a bell. Public meant permission. Public meant Mark could stand outside my house at 3 a.m. and collect pieces of me and the law, my truck. So I documented. I recorded every clip, every timestamp, every frame where Mark's face turned toward my camera with that small, knowing smile. I started taking my trash out in the morning instead of the night. I started double bagging. I started driving it to a dumpster at a gas station like an idiot with a secret. And still, on the third night, the driveway camera buzzed again, and Mark was there anyway, standing beside my bins as if he'd been waiting for them to appear. Except this time, there were no bins. I hadn't put them out. He stood at the exact spot where they usually sat, and raised his phone, taking pictures of the empty curb as if the trash was there, and I just couldn't see it. He snapped 3 photos of nothing, then lowered the phone and looked directly at my front window. He lifted the phone to his ear, like he was listening to a call. He nodded once, slow. Then he crouched and reached into the snow at the base of my mailbox, and pulled out something small and dark I hadn't noticed in daylight. A plastic bag. My stomach sank. I watched him open the bag carefully and remove a handful of torn paper scraps. He laid them out on the snow like puzzle pieces and photographed them in a grid. It took me a second to understand what I was seeing. He had my shredded mail. Not from the curb, from my house. From inside. My wife made a sound like a swallowed sob. I ran downstairs not to confront him. I wasn't brave, just desperate, and checked every lock, every window, every door. Nothing was open. Nothing was broken. The house looked normal. That was the worst part. The normalcy. The way violation could happen without visible force. I went to the basement, flashlight in hand, and stared at the shelving unit I'd shoved in front of the vent cover after the tunnel discovery. The boxes were exactly where I'd left them. The shelf hadn't moved, but the air in the basement felt colder than the rest of the house, and there was that same damp, sharp smell like fresh soil. I crouched and pressed my fingers against the concrete rectangle I'd noticed before. The line was darker now, wider, as if someone had been working along it from the other side, scraping and cutting while we slept upstairs, believing in our locks. I backed away and forced myself upstairs again, because what else could I do in the middle of the night except watch? On the feed, Mark finished photographing the scraps, then placed them back in the bag and tucked the bag into the snow at the base of my mailbox, again like he was storing it for later. He stood and brushed snow from his knees. Then he did something so small and intimate, it made me feel physically ill. He lifted my trash can lid and looked inside, even though it was empty, and he smiled as if he liked what he saw. He stepped away, turned toward his house, and as he walked, he spoke softly. Not loud enough for the camera microphone to catch words, but loud enough that I could see his lips form them. He was talking to someone beside him again, nodding, listening. At 3 doors each, she shut there. My phone buzzed with a new notification. Not from a camera, not from an app, but a standard text message from an unknown number. No greeting, no threat. Just a single sentence that froze me in place because it proved the trash photos were already a weapon. You switched to decaf on Tuesday. My wife stared at me like I'd been shot. That morning I checked my trash history in my own head and realized what he'd seen. The empty decaf box, the receipt, the torn label. Nothing private, nothing illegal, nothing that sounded like a horror movie. And yet, the message felt like a hand on the back of my neck, guiding my head to look where it wanted. I didn't reply. I blocked the number. A minute later, another text arrived from a different number. You threw away the blue bottle, not the white one. Prescription. The bottle I'd hidden label removed cap tightened. My stomach turned over. I went to the cabinet where I kept the sensitive trash bag and ripped it open with shaking hands. The shredded mail was there, sure. The decaf box pieces were there, but the blue bottle wasn't. It was gone. I stood in my kitchen, staring at a missing piece of plastic, understanding that Mark didn't need to break a window anymore. He was already inside the part of my life that mattered. That night, before I went to bed, I moved my trash cans into the garage and blocked the door with a chair like a child. At 3 duja. The garage camera pinged motion. When I opened the feed, Mark was not in my driveway. He was in my garage, standing beside my trash cans, phone raised, photographing the labels I'd tried so hard to remove. He looked up at the camera and smiled. And behind him, in the thin strip of darkness between the garage wall and the back door, a second figure stood perfectly still, just a person-shaped absence, as if the night itself had learned my bid, outline, and decided to live in it. At 3, unsprzecia. My driveway camera sent a notification so ordinary, I almost ignored it. Motion detected. When I opened the feed, the first thing I saw was the snow fresh unbroken, the kind that makes a neighborhood look erased. The second thing I saw was Mark moving through it, like he had forgotten how to be human. He was on all fours, hands and knees, sinking into the powder, pulling himself forward in a slow, steady crawl from the shadow of his side yard toward mine. No fumbling, no hesitation, no awkwardness, just that patient animal rhythm like he had. Practice how to approach a house without ever leaving the kind of tracks a person leaves. The infrared turned his face into a pale smear beneath his hood, but I could still see his eyes lifted toward my windows, checking them the way a predator checks a fence line. My wife whispered, "Is he crawling?" And the way she said it made my stomach twist because it wasn't disbelief anymore. It was recognition. Mark reached the edge of my driveway and stopped so suddenly it looked like the feed had frozen. For a long moment he didn't move at all, and that stillness felt familiar now, like the first night, all over again. like he was waiting for me to make the first mistake by assuming he had left. Then he began again, crawling along the shadowed edge of the driveway, keeping his body low, moving in a neat path that hugged the dark where my porch light couldn't reach. Every few feet he paused and tilted his head, listening like he could hear the electrical hum of my cameras, like the house itself had a voice, and he understood it. I wanted to hit the doorbell mic, to demand he stand up to force him back into the shape of a man. But after the recorder, after the missing trash, after the night, my own light stopped obeying me. I didn't trust my house to speak for me anymore. Mark crawled to the base of my front steps and stopped directly beneath the doorbell camera. The motion box snapped around him, jittered, then widened as if the software couldn't decide where his body began and ended. He lifted his head and stared straight into the lens, holding eye contact so long it stopped feeling like being watched and started feeling like being measured, like someone studying the distance between landmarks before they choose a route. Then he lowered his face to the snow and pressed his cheek into it, slow, deliberate, as if he were tasting my yard. When he lifted his head again, a dark, wet smear stained the white like a tongue print, and I felt something cold and ancient slide down my spine, because I realized he wasn't doing this to scare me. He was doing it to learn what I would do. Mark crawled past the steps and toward the side of the house, where the basement windows sit low, half hidden behind shrubs. He moved faster there, hands punching into the snow, knees sliding like he was suddenly eager. He stopped at the basement window well and leaned over it, shoulders rising, head dropping out of view, as if he were peering down into the dark. And then he disappeared from the frame, lowering himself with calm precision, as if the earth had opened to receive him. The motion light by that window flicked on and stayed on, but the camera saw nothing. Still, my phone buzzed again. Person detected. The box hovered over the empty window well like a warning label stuck to air. And then separate from the phone's speaker, I heard it. An actual sound in my house down low, like a scrape beneath the floorboards, followed by a soft tap, as if a knuckle had tested wood from the wrong side. My wife gripped my arm and whispered, "Please don't go down there," but the scrape came again longer, this time like something shifting its weight in a tight space. I grabbed a flashlight and went to the basement with my heart trying to climb out of my chest. The air down there smelled wrong again, damp soil and cold metal like a cellar that had been opened after years sealed shut. The shelving unit I'd shoved in front of the hidden vent was still there, but one of the boxes on top sat crooked, as if something had bumped it and tried to put it back. My beam caught the vent cover, and I saw the screws were no longer flush. One was backed out a quarter turn. The cover itself bulged outward, just slightly, like the wood behind it was breathing. I stood there holding my breath, because suddenly the crawl made perfect sense. On all fours he would fit. Beneath the concrete, beneath what I had always believed was solid earth, I heard a slow dragging sound, careful and close, like someone moving on elbows. I backed up until my shoulder hit the cold basement wall. At that exact moment, my wife screamed from upstairs that the driveway camera had motion again. I sprinted up and snatched the phone from her shaking hands. The feed showed Mark outside again, crawling in my driveway like nothing had happened, like he had never disappeared into the basement window, well, at all. Same hood, same pale face, same steady rhythm. Two places at once, or one place that made the camera lie. I didn't have time to decide which was worse. I called 911 and said flat and controlled, "My neighbor is on my property right now. He's crawling around my house. I think he's trying to get in." This time, my voice didn't sound ridiculous. It sounded like a report, because the fear had sharpened into certainty. While we waited, Mark stopped crawling and turned his head toward the basement side of the house, listening, and I realized he wasn't listening to me. He was listening to something inside my walls. His mouth moved as if whispering, but the camera mic caught only winter static. Then he lifted one hand off the snow and made a small, beckoning motion toward the side yard, like calling a dog. The side yard camera's motion box jumped, then steadied, outlining a low shape, moving along my foundation so low it could only have been on all fours. But the image showed nothing, just that box, sliding over blank snow, stopping, starting, creeping forward. My wife backed away from the screen with a hand over her mouth. I couldn't move. I watched the box reach the basement window, well, hover there, then vanish as if it had dropped through the ground. Outside on the driveway feed, Mark finally stood up. He rose smoothly, without using his hands, and I felt a sick jolt of relief that he looked normal again, like I'd been trained to prefer him in one shape over another. He brushed snow from his knees and looked up at my bedroom window, then smiled slowly, privately, the way you smile when a plan works. Police lights arrived minutes later, blue and red slicing across white snow. 2 officers approached my driveway with flashlights, low hands near their belts. Mark walked back across the street at an easy pace and stopped at the edge of his yard, turning to watch them like someone waiting for a late appointment. I met the officers at the door and showed them the footage. In the beam of their flashlights, the impressions in my driveway were unmistakable, deep handprints and knee prints. In a steady pattern, the track of a full-grown man crawling for 20 yards. One officer crouched and touched the impressions, then looked at me with the kind of expression that runs out of polite explanations. "They're fresh," he said. They followed the crawl marks to the basement window. Well, at the edge the impressions stopped, abruptly. No standing footprints, no transition, just an ending, like someone had been pulled straight down. The officer shined his light into the well and swore softly. "There's disturbed dirt," he said, and my knees went weak. They crossed the street and knocked on Mark's door. Mark answered in a t-shirt and pajama pants. Hair, must eyes, clear acting, startled to see police. "He says you were in his yard," the officer told him. Mark blinked slowly, then gave a small laugh, like it was an absurd rumor. "I've been asleep," he said, holding up both hands. The officer's gaze flicked to Mark's bare feet, dry clean, no soil. Mark's smile stayed in place. "Probably a fox," he offered. "People get paranoid. Snow does that." The officers couldn't arrest him for being wrong-shaped in the night, and if the proof lived in snow, snow could be changed. After they left, the crawl impressions softened under fresh flakes, until the driveway looked almost normal again. But at 3:05 late, my phone buzzed one more time. Motion detected. I opened it and saw my driveway empty, yet the motion box hovered low to the ground, moving slowly toward my front steps, in that same steady rhythm, as if whatever had learned to crawl had decided it didn't need Mark's body anymore. At 2:15 Shishasea. The sound that woke me was the soft, familiar chime of my front door opening. Not the violent crash you expect in nightmares, just the gentle electronic tone we'd set up for our own convenience. The sound meant to say someone's home. My eyes snapped open, and for a second my brain tried to insist it was my wife getting water or checking the thermostat. Then the chime came again, followed by the faint click of the deadbolt. An impossible sound, because I had locked it myself and tested it twice, like a ritual. My wife sat up, wide-eyed, and whispered my name like she was afraid a louder voice would be heard. I grabbed my phone and opened the doorbell camera feed. The porch was empty. No hooded figure. No snowman. No Mark. But the front door sensor history showed. Unlocked at 25612 and opened at 25614. Logged as if it had been done from inside the house. I didn't have time to process how. Footsteps drifted from downstairs, slow and bare, like someone walking without shoes. I crept to the top of the stairs, heart pounding, and looked down. Mark was in my living room. He stood near the couch in grey sweatpants and a thin t-shirt, hair flattened like he'd been sleeping, feet bare on my hardwood. His posture was wrong, loose and heavy, shoulders slack, head slightly bowed like someone who had been unplugged. His eyes were open but unfocused, staring past the TV toward nothing. He wasn't holding a weapon. He didn't look alert. He looked like a man who had wandered into the wrong room and hadn't realized it yet. My wife made a small sound behind me, and Mark's head turned toward the stairs, slow, delayed, like a sleepwalker, responding to a voice through water. He lifted one hand, palm out, not threatening, almost placating. "Sorry," he murmured, voice soft and thick as if he were half asleep. I get confused sometimes." The words were normal, the tone was normal, and that was what terrified me most, because normal was how you make people doubt themselves. "Mark," I said, keeping my voice low, "you're in my house." He blinked slowly once, twice, like he was trying to bring the room into focus. I thought this was mine," he whispered, and he smiled faintly, not at me, but at something near the hallway, like he was reassured by a presence I couldn't see. My wife whispered, "How did you get in?" And Mark's gaze flicked to the front door as if the question annoyed him. "I walk," he said simply. "I don't remember it. I wake up places." He looked down at his bare feet, then up again, with that same calm, detached expression. "It happens when it's cold." I held the banister with one hand, because I realized my knees were shaking. "Get out," I said. Mark's smile didn't change. "Okay," he murmured, obedient as a child. He walked to the front door and I watched him from the stairs, praying he would touch a lock, trip an alarm, and leave some proof that he had physically interacted with the mechanism. He didn't. He stopped in front of the door and waited. The deadbolt turned with a soft click, smooth and precise, and I saw with horror that his hands were at his sides. The lock rotated on its own. The door opened. Cold air poured in. Mark stepped out onto my porch, barefoot, not even flinching at the ice, and the door swung shut behind him as gently as if someone had closed it from the inside. I rushed down and yanked it open again, looking for him on the porch, on the steps, on the driveway. He was already in his yard across the street, walking away at an unhurried pace, hands in his pockets, shoulders relaxed like a man returning from a midnight stroll. I called 911. Officers arrived, listened, took notes, and treated it like a misunderstanding, with a creepy edge. A neighbor with a sleepwalking issue who must have had an old key or a similar lock. They asked if he'd stolen anything. He hadn't. They asked if he'd threatened us. He hadn't. They suggested we change the locks. They suggested we get a doorbell. They suggested we keep documenting. They left. In the morning, Mark came to my porch, in a winter coat, with a paper bag of store-bought cookies and an apologetic smile. "I'm really sorry," he said. "It's embarrassing. I have episodes. My doctor said stress can trigger it." He held the bag out like a peace offering. I didn't take it. I stared at his hands, searching for the shape of a key, the bulge of a tool, anything that made him ordinary. "How did you unlock my deadbolt?" I asked. Mark's smile widened just a fraction, like he enjoyed the question. "I must have," he said softly. "I don't remember." Then he leaned closer, lowering his voice to something that sounded almost kind. "If you're scared, you should sleep with the hall light on." That night we installed a new deadbolt, a doorbell, and a battery-powered chime that screamed if the door moved even an inch. I set up a camera inside the living room, aimed at the front door. I placed a strip of painter's tape across the basement door seam like a cheap seal, the kind that would tear if the door opened, because I couldn't stop thinking about the smell of soil and the hidden vent and the way his bare feet had been. Too clean for a man who'd walked across snow. A très doué. A.M. I woke to the sensation of being watched. No shime. No alarm. No door sound. Just that animal certainty in my bones. I opened my eyes and saw the hall light glowing under our bedroom door, a thin line like a mouth that refused to close. I hadn't left it on. My wife was awake too, breathing shallowly, staring at the door. Then the line of light widened as a shadow moved across it. Slow, steady close. Footsteps crossed the hallway outside, soft and bare. I grabbed my phone and opened the living room camera feed. The front door was closed. The tape seal on the basement door was torn clean down the middle, and Mark was standing at the bottom of my stairs, barefoot again, but this time his feet were smeared with dark, damp soil, the kind that comes from underground. He looked up at the camera like he knew exactly where it was, and he lifted one finger to his lips in a quiet, shushing gesture. My blood turned to ice. He didn't look confused now. He didn't look asleep. He looked patient. He started up the stairs without hurry, one step at a time, feet leaving small wet prints on the wood. Halfway up he paused and turned his head slightly toward the basement, listening as if something down there had spoken. Then he smiled, and continued eyes fixed on the upper hallway, like he was coming to check on something he owned. I shoved my wife behind me, grabbed the heaviest object I could reach, a lamp base, and stood in the bedroom doorway. Mark reached the top step and stopped in the hall a few feet from me. Head tilted, eyes bright and fully awake. "You didn't leave the light on," he whispered, and the words hit me like a private joke because I understood he was referencing his own advice from the day before. He knew what we'd do. He knew how we'd respond. He took one small step forward, and the air filled with that damp soil smell. "Mark," I said, voice shaking despite my effort, "you're not sleepwalking." Mark's smile widened. "No," he whispered, and his gaze slid past my shoulder into the bedroom as if counting where we were standing. Then he did something that stole the breath from my lungs. He spoke in my voice, smooth and calm, the same cadence from the recorder file. In my voice, he said, "He's awake." And from somewhere deeper in the house, low and unseen, another voice answered, Mark's voice pleased and gentle, "I know." Mark in the hallway watched my face, as if he could taste the fear. Then, without breaking eye contact, he began to step backwards slowly down the stairs, retreating as if luring me to follow. I didn't. I stayed rigid in the doorway, holding the lamp like it could change physics. Mark reached the bottom step and turned toward the basement door, the torn tape hanging like a tongue. He placed his palm flat against the door. It swung open, without a sound, like it had been waiting. Mark stepped into the basement darkness and vanished. The living room camera feed flickered once, then steadied on an empty stairwell. I ran downstairs anyway because panic makes you stupid, and in the basement the air was colder and wetter than it had any right to be. The shelving unit had been moved, not dragged, placed carefully a few inches to the side. The vent cover was off, leaning against the wall like someone had removed it politely. The man-sized rectangle in the concrete had widened into a real seam, and inside the crawlspace the dirt looked freshly disturbed like someone had just slid through. On the ground beside the opening was a single object, set neatly as if it were a gift, the bag of cookies from earlier torn open with one cookie missing. On top of the bag was a small handwritten note, in clean, calm print. "Sleepwalking is the excuse that lets me practice." I stood there with my flashlight shaking, and behind me upstairs, the front door chime finally rang. Soft, cheerful, useless, like my house was politely announcing a visitor who was already inside. I woke up at 3:22 a.m. because the house smelled like smoke. Not the cozy fireplace kind, but the sharp, dirty burn of synthetic fabric, the kind that grabs the back of your throat and makes your brain shout fire before you're fully awake. My wife sat up at the same time, eyes wide, whispering that she smelled it too. I ran downstairs, expecting to see orange light under a door, but the living room was dark, the kitchen normal, the air just wrong, as if the smoke had seeped in through the walls instead of an open window. My phone was already buzzing with alerts, backyard camera motion, side yard motion, so I opened the backyard feed and felt my chest tighten when I saw the source. Mark's fire pit across the fence line was blazing bright enough to turn falling snow into glitter. He stood beside it in his winter coat, hood-up face pale in the infrared, holding a black trash bag like a sack of feed. He didn't move, like someone trying to stay warm. He moved like someone conducting a task that mattered. He reached into the bag and pulled out a piece of clothing, shook it once to unfold it, and for a second my brain refused what my eyes were giving it, because the garment was familiar in the way a nightmare is familiar. My wife's pajama top, the faded one with the small white stars that she wore when it was too cold to be cute. Mark held it up at chest height, studied it under the firelight, then turned his head toward my house, as if checking whether I was watching. When he saw the glow of our upstairs bedroom through the thin gap in curtains, he smiled faintly and dropped the pajama top into the flames. It didn't burn like cotton. It shrank and curled and spat dark smoke that rolled low over the snow, and I felt my wife's hand clamp onto my arm behind me so hard it hurt. "That's mine," she whispered, voice breaking on the word. I couldn't answer, because I was suddenly remembering small annoyances from the last week that I'd dismissed as stress socks, going missing, a dish towel that vanished, the hamper feeling lighter than it should, like our life was shedding small. Skin flakes we couldn't track. Mark reached into the bag again and pulled out another item, grey, fabric, longer, heavier. He shook it out, and it hung in his hands like a flag. My stomach dropped when I recognized it, my hoodie, the one with the frayed cuff I always meant to fix. I watched him run his glove along the cuff, as if appreciating the wear pattern. Then he leaned toward the empty air at his shoulder and said something too quiet for the camera mic to catch. He nodded once, like someone had answered him. Then he tossed my hoodie into the pit. The flames flared, and in the flare, I thought I saw movement behind Mark, a darker shape in the dark beyond the fire, standing too still to be smoke, too tall to be a bush. The camera's motion box jittered over empty snow beside him and then locked on a person-shaped absence, as if the software could see what the picture couldn't. My phone buzzed again. Person detected. While the screen showed nothing but Mark and fire and the swirling night. He kept going. A dish towel, a baby blanket we didn't even have, which made no sense until I realized it wasn't ours at all, and my blood ran colder. He wasn't only burning our things. He was burning other people's things, too. He was burning evidence. He was burning lives. He pulled out a pair of jeans and held them up, turning them to show the pockets, the seams, the way you'd inspect an item at a thrift store. Then he did something that turned my stomach. He reached into the pocket and removed a small object, held it between two fingers, and lifted it toward his face, like he was savoring a smell. The camera zoomed slightly, either an automatic focus, or him stepping closer, and I saw it clearly, a house key. Not his, not ours. A plain brass key with a small red plastic cap. Mark looked toward my window again. Then he dropped the key into the fire, like it was nothing. Metal pinged softly as it hit the stone rim, then disappeared into flame. My wife whispered, "Call the police," and I did. But even as the dispatcher answered, I could hear how absurd it would sound. My neighbor is burning my clothes at 3 a.m. The dispatcher asked if I was sure it was my property. I said yes. She asked how he got it. I said I didn't know, and I hated that answer, because it was the truth. I told her I had video. She said officers would be sent. While I stayed on the line, Mark reached into the bag and pulled out one last item, smaller folded. He unfolded it carefully and held it up to the firelight like a prize. It was a t-shirt, white once, now dingy with a printed photo on the front. My wife and me on our moving day, standing in front of the house with stupid, hopeful smiles. We had posted that photo in the neighborhood group chat when we first arrived. I had deleted it afterward, but the internet doesn't really delete, and Mark didn't need the internet if he could take what he wanted from our home. Mark watched the photo in his hands for a long moment, expression unreadable. Then he turned the shirt so the picture faced my house directly, like he wanted the image to be the last thing I saw before it was destroyed. He leaned toward the empty air beside him and spoke louder this time, and the microphone caught just enough to chill me. This one matters. He nodded once, then let it go. The shirt caught, curled, blackened. The printed faces warped in the heat until our smiles became dark smears. I realized I was shaking so hard my teeth clicked. In the corner of the feed, the motion box still hovered beside Mark, tracking something that refused to show itself. Mark didn't seem bothered. If anything, he seemed comforted. He held his hands out toward the pit like he was warming them, and in the glow his shadow stretched across the snow toward my fence line, long and thin, touching my side of the yard like a finger. Then he looked straight into his backyard camera, his own lens, and smiled as if he knew I'd be watching through it, as if he'd positioned it for this moment. You can't keep everything he said softly, and the words were clear enough that my stomach dropped because he hadn't been speaking to a person beside him. He'd been speaking to the camera, to me. Police lights arrived 10 minutes later, too late to stop anything the way help always arrives after the damage is done. By the time officers approached Mark's yard, the fire pit was mostly embers. The bag was gone. Mark stood calmly on his porch, in a robe holding a mug, acting surprised to see anyone. From inside my house, I watched them speak to him, watched him gesture with one hand, as if explaining a harmless late-night clean-out. They shined lights on the snow. They looked for a trail carrying stolen clothing. Snow covered a lot. They walked away with that careful professional posture that says we can't do much without proof that survives daylight. After they left, the neighborhood returned to quiet. The air inside my house still tasted like burned plastic, and I couldn't stop thinking about the key Mark had melted. I went outside at dawn, after the cold light made everything look honest, and walked along the fence line near Mark's fire pit. The snow there was peppered with tiny black flecks, like soot confetti. I crouched and picked one up. It wasn't ash. It was fabric, melted into a hard, glossy curl. I found another piece. A snapped plastic button. Familiar shape, familiar brand. Mine. Then I found the worst thing. Half buried in the snow like the earth was trying to hide it. The corner of the printed t-shirt photo, just a fragment of my wife's cheek, and my own eye warped and blackened, but still recognizable. I held it in my glove and felt something in me crack. Not fear exactly, but the understanding that Mark wasn't improvising. He was editing. He was curating what parts of our lives were allowed to remain. That night, we moved all clothing into the upstairs bedroom and jammed the closet door with a chair. Like that would stop someone who could open deadbolts without touching them. At 3 unua. The house smelled like smoke, again faint at first, then stronger, and my phone buzzed with a single text from an unknown number. It's easier when it's warm. The first thing hit the window at 3:04 a.m. A sharp, single tap that sounded like a pebble against glass. Not loud enough to wake a neighborhood, just loud enough to wake the specific kind of person who sleeps lightly because they expect the night to try something. I sat up instantly, my wife already awake beside me, and we listened. 10 seconds of silence. Then another tap, same window, same careful force, like someone testing the thickness of the glass, rather than trying to break it. I opened the front camera feed and saw the porch empty, the driveway empty, the street empty, except for snow drifting in the streetlight like pale dust. No Mark. No hooded figure. Nothing. And yet the camera's motion box appeared at the bottom edge of the frame, jittering low near the front steps as if something crouched there just outside the camera's clean view. My phone buzzed. Person detected, even though the picture showed nothing. Another tap came harder. I slid out of bed and crept to the hallway window that overlooks the porch, keeping the curtain closed. I didn't want to give the night a clear answer about where I stood. The third tap struck the glass at a slightly different angle higher, like the thrower had adjusted their aim. Then something skittered down the outside ledge and fell onto the porch boards with a soft click. I froze, waiting for footsteps, a laugh, any sign of a prank. Silence. I forced myself to check the porch view again, and saw an object sitting exactly where Mark had once pointed, centered under the camera, like it had been placed with intention. It was small and dark. I zoomed in until the pixels blurred, and my stomach tightened when I realized it was not a pebble. It was a button. A snapped plastic button, scorched at the edges, the same kind I'd found in the snow near Mark's fire pit. My wife whispered, "Don't open the door," and I nodded because opening the door was what this wanted. Another tap came immediately after, and something heavier struck the lower pane of the living room window with a dull thud that made the whole frame shiver. The sound traveled through the house, like a warning. I ran downstairs, staying away from the glass, and checked the living room camera I'd installed, facing the front door. The room was still, the door bar still in place, the new deadbolt untouched. But the air felt charged, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Another object hit the window, thud slide, and landed on the carpet inside the room, and for a second my brain short-circuited, because that couldn't happen unless the window was open or broken. I stared at the intact glass, at the closed latch, at the untouched curtains. The object on the carpet was a coin, wet and cold, leaving a tiny melt halo as if it had been pulled from snow and thrown through a gap that didn't exist. I picked it up with shaking fingers. It was a quarter, ordinary, except the face side was scraped clean, smoothed down so the profile was almost gone, as if someone didn't want any identifiable mark on it at all. Then another object landed soft, this time more like a dropped thing than a thrown one, and rolled to a stop near the baseboard. A key, plain brass, with a small red plastic cap, the same kind of key Mark had dropped into his fire. I held it and felt my pulse in my fingertips. This wasn't random vandalism. This was inventory, a reminder of what could be taken and returned. Upstairs, my wife whispered that something hit the bedroom window again faster, now a series of taps like impatient fingers. I checked the exterior camera feed, and still saw nothing. yet the motion box crawled along the bottom edge of the frame in short bursts. Stop, start, stop, like something moving close to the house on all fours. Then the box rose suddenly, jumping to the height of the window, as if whatever was out there had stood up. A faint shadow crossed the streetlight's glow and vanished. The camera didn't catch a body, only the absence of light where a body should have been. Then the tap stopped, replaced by a sound that made my stomach flip, a soft scraping along the siding, like something being dragged upward. My eyes went to the ceiling without permission. Roof. The nightmare you never want, because you can't see it from any window without exposing yourself. I backed away from the living room glass and looked at the ceiling corner, where the wall meets the second floor, listening. Above a slow, careful step. Another. Not the heavy stomp of a person, but the measured shift of weight, like someone walking barefoot on shingles. My wife came down the stairs, clutching her phone like it was a weapon, whispering that the bedroom window had something on it. I didn't ask what. I didn't want to give my imagination extra ingredients. Another object hit the living room window harder than the others, and this time the glass vibrated with a thin, high ring that made my teeth ache. The object didn't fall outside. It fell inside. It landed on the couch cushion, as if someone had tossed it gently into the room. It was a small USB drive, black, the cheap kind you get in a multi-pack. A strip of masking tape was wrapped around it, with handwriting in clean block letters. Play me. My wife started to cry without sound. I didn't want to plug it in. I didn't want to know. But the fact that it had appeared inside my locked house meant the choice wasn't really mine anymore. I grabbed my laptop not because I felt brave, but because I needed to control the order of the harm. I plugged it in with shaking hands. A single video file opened automatically, as if it had been configured to do so. The timestamp read 247A. Last night. The video angle was familiar. Our bedroom seen from above, from the ceiling corner. Not a baby monitor. Not a phone on a nightstand. A hidden camera. The frame showed my wife and me sleeping, our faces turned toward each other like we still believed in normal. For a moment, nothing happened, and I felt the nausea rising because even that being watched while asleep was a violation too clean to scream about. Then in the corner of the frame, the bedroom door eased open, without a sound. No hallway light spill, just darkness folding inward. A figure entered on all fours, low and careful, moving with the same steady crawl I'd seen in the driveway footage. It reached the side of our bed and stopped. The camera captured the pause like a held breath. Then the figure rose slowly to standing, and even though the face remained in shadow, I recognized the posture, the calm shoulders, the head tilt, as Mark's. He stood over us for a full minute, without moving. Then he leaned down near my wife's ear and whispered something too quiet for the camera mic to catch. Yet the sound meter spiked, as if the microphone had registered breath. My wife in the video twitched, but didn't wake. Mark straightened, looked up directly into the hidden camera, and smiled. He raised one finger to his lips. Shh. And then in my own voice, smooth and patient, he said clearly enough to hear through laptop speakers, "He'll open it." The file ended. The screen went black. At the exact same moment, something hit the front door from the outside thud, followed by 3 slow knocks, perfectly spaced like the bathroom door the night my phone died. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The inside living room camera feed flickered once, then showed the front door handle turning. Not fast, not forced, but gentle, like a hand testing whether the lock was tired yet. My wife backed into the kitchen, whispering my name like a warning. I stared at the scattered objects on the floor. The button, the quarter, the key, the USB. Each one a sentence in a language Mark had been teaching me to understand. The lesson was simple. The window didn't need to break for things to get in. The door didn't need to open for someone to enter. The only consistent rule was that the night could reach me whenever it wanted, and it was only waiting to see which part of me would give way first. I didn't sleep after the door handle turned on its own. Not really. Not the way you sleep when you believe a lock is a promise. I sat in the living room with the inside camera feed open on my phone, watching the front door like it might blink. while my wife curled up in the corner, clutching her phone as if a screen could ward off a person who didn't need to touch. Anything to get in. The knocking stopped after 3 slow taps, and the handle returned to center as gently as it had moved, like whoever was outside had simply confirmed what they already knew. At 3 nos prezecha M. The porch camera pinged motion and showed nothing. Empty steps drifting snow, yet the system drew the bright box, where a person should have been hovering at the exact height of a face, looking into the glass. Then the motion box slid toward the edge of the frame and vanished, as if something had stepped down off the porch without leaving a body behind. Morning arrived pale and brutal, the kind of winter light that makes everything look honest, even when it isn't. I walked outside with gloves on, and my phone recording, forcing myself to do the daylight version of bravery. The porch boards were clean, no footprints, no disturbed snow. The window glass was intact. The only evidence of last night's impossible objects was the key, with the red plastic cap sitting on my kitchen counter, cold and real, in a way my fear wished it wasn't. I knelt by the front steps and ran my hand along the bottom edge of the porch railing. Not because I had a theory, but because my brain was now trained to hunt for tiny wrongness. My glove snagged on something rough. I leaned closer and saw a pea-sized smear of fresh black adhesive under the rail, like a spot of tar. Embedded in the adhesive was a small oval of plastic, matte black, so carefully placed, it looked like part of the wood grain, unless you knew to look. I pried it loose with my key, and the thing came away in my gloved palm. A tiny microphone capsule with a pinhole opening, and a thread-thin wire leading to a battery the size of a coin, both wrapped in weatherproof tape. It was a listening device. Not hidden in my house, not deep in a vent, right on my porch, inches from my front door, where it could hear every argument, every late-night call, every whisper of panic. My stomach tightened with the most humiliating kind of anger, the kind that comes from realizing how much of your life you've been living out loud. I brought it inside, set it on the table, and stared at it, as if it might start speaking. My wife stood behind me and said very quietly, "That means he's been listening the whole time." I called the police again, and I didn't bother trying to make it sound normal. I told them we'd found a surveillance device on our property. 2 officers came, took photos, put it in a small evidence bag, and asked if we had suspects. I said Mark's name. One officer's expression tightened, but his questions stayed careful. Did I have proof Mark installed it? Did I see him on my porch? Did I have video of his hands placing it? I showed him the clips where the motion box hovered over nothing, where objects appeared inside my locked house, where Mark stood in my driveway talking to air. He watched with the same professional neutrality I'd started to hate the neutrality of a system that can only respond to certain shapes of harm. He told me they would document it and follow up words that sounded like empty containers. After they left, I did something I never thought I'd do in my own living room. I hired a guy with an RF detector and a calm voice, who introduced himself like this wasn't his first haunted house. He walked through each room slowly, sweeping the wand near outlets, smoke detectors, vents, the underside of furniture, and every time the device chirped, my throat tightened. The first chirp came near the front door chime. The technician removed the plastic cover and found a transmitter tucked behind it, its antenna taped flat like a hidden tongue. The second chirp came from the living room lamp I'd watched turn on and off in perfect sync with Mark's. There was a small board inside the base that didn't match the manufacturer's design. The third chirp came in the bedroom, and my wife made a sound when he pointed to the smoke detector above the closet. He unscrewed it, and a tiny camera dropped into his palm, the same cheap kind you can buy in a pack, the kind that only needs a little Wi-Fi and a little access to make your privacy into a joke. The technician asked gently if we wanted him to keep sweeping. I said yes, because stopping would mean accepting that we'd only found the devices we were meant to find. He swept the basement last. The detector chirped near the shelving unit near the hidden vent, and I felt my mouth go dry because the signal was strongest when the wand hovered over the concrete rectangle seam. "There's something active behind there," he said. "Could be a repeater." He advised we seal it. Concrete patch, professional inspection, maybe structural work. Then he paused and said something that made my blood run cold. "Also, some of these devices are set to transmit on a schedule. That means someone knows when to listen." As if to prove the point, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, and I watched my wife's face change as she read it over my shoulder. The cops will keep asking for proof. A second later, you should stop saying my name. My hands went numb around the phone because the timing was too perfect. He had listened to the police conversation through the bug on the porch or the transmitter in the door chime, and he had responded in real time, like a person watching a live stream. I didn't reply. I powered off the phone, then powered off my wife's, then unplugged our router, like that would cut the line between our words and his ears. The technician looked at me the way you look at someone standing in rising water, and he said quietly, "If he's this confident, he thinks you can't get away from him." That night, we didn't use our bedroom. We dragged an old mattress into the dining room away from windows, away from the upstairs camera angles we no longer trusted, and we lay there fully clothed with a flashlight between us, like a third person. The house was silent, except for winter wind and our own breathing. At 2:50 shiopte. Even with the router unplugged, even with phones powered down, we heard a soft click from the front porch and the sound of plastic snapping into place. Then a faint, barely audible hiss, like a small radio waking up. My wife pressed her hand over her mouth. I stood perfectly still, listening, and realized the porch bug had never been about hearing me call the police. It was about hearing me decide what I was willing to do next. Somewhere outside in the cold dark, just beyond the door, something was listening again, and this time, it wasn't hiding under my railing. It wanted me to know exactly where it was. Two days after we found the listening devices, Mark built the platform. It went up in a single afternoon, fast enough to feel like he'd already cut the wood and measured the angles long before he carried a single board outside. I noticed it around dusk, when the sky was the color of dirty cotton and the neighborhood looked flat and tired. In his backyard, just inside the fence line, a simple wooden tower had appeared. 4 posts, cross-bracing a small deck about 8 feet off the ground, with a ladder fixed to one side. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't even well finished. It looked like something you'd build when you didn't care if it lasted, only that it existed. The worst part was its position. It wasn't facing his garden. It wasn't tucked near a tree for a view. It was aligned directly with the back corner of our house, where the upstairs bedroom window sat, where my wife used to stand in the morning and open the blinds before we learned blinds were invitations. I stood at my kitchen sink and stared through the glass, feeling that familiar slide of dread into certainty. My wife asked what I was looking at, and when she saw the platform, she went still, like her body understood before her mind caught up. "That's for us," she said. Not a question. That night, at 3:06 a.m., the backyard camera pinged motion, and the feed showed Mark climbing the ladder with slow, careful steps. He reached the top and stood on the deck, hands resting on the rail posture, relaxed head angled toward our windows, as if he were checking weather. Snow fell in steady curtains and the streetlight backlit him so he looked like a cutout pasted onto the dark. He didn't have binoculars. He didn't need them. He just stood there perfectly still, the way he had stood in my yard the first night, except now he was elevated, given a better angle by wood and nails and a legal property line. I turned on our backyard floodlights. The sudden white glare washed the snow and turned Mark into a crisp silhouette, and he didn't flinch. He lifted one hand and waved slow and friendly like he was greeting a neighbor across a fence. Then he pointed down toward his deck, tapped the railing twice, and pointed at our house again, as if signaling from here I can see. In the morning I marched over to his front door, not because I thought confrontation would fix anything, but because I needed to feel like I existed in the same physical world as him, where words could still be thrown. Mark answered in a sweater mug in hand, smiling as if he'd been expecting the visit. I asked him what the platform was for. He didn't hesitate. "Bird watching," he said. "Winter birds. You'd be surprised what shows up." He tilted his head slightly and looked past me over my shoulder toward my house. "You've got good trees," he added softly. My throat tightened. "It points at my bedroom," I said. Mark's smile stayed, but his eyes sharpened as if he enjoyed being understood. "It's my yard," he said. "I can stand where I like." I told him it was harassment. He shrugged, with theatrical calm. "Then don't look," he said, and the cruelty of it was how reasonable it sounded. I called the city about ordinances, about structures, about sightlines. A bored-sounding person told me anything under a certain height didn't need a permit in our area, and fences didn't guarantee privacy. Privacy apparently was a personal hobby, not a right. We put up blackout curtains. We added privacy film. We started changing clothes in the bathroom with the door closed, like teenagers hiding from a strict parent. And still, the platform changed the way the house felt, because it meant the backyard was no longer ours. It was a stage viewed from above. On the third night, I woke to my phone, buzzing with a camera alert, and saw Mark on the platform again, but something was different. The motion box on the feed wasn't just around him. It jittered beside him too. Tracking a second shape, the camera couldn't render something taller than the rail, standing just off Mark's right shoulder, like a quiet companion. Mark didn't look at it. He looked at our house, and he lifted his hand, as if he were holding an invisible object, then mimed, placing that object on the platform rail. The motion box beside him pulsed, then steadied as if something had just been set down. A minute later, my phone buzzed with a new alert from a device we'd never installed. New camera connected. I stared at the screen, blood turning cold, because the only new camera in the area would be one placed high above the fence line with a clean view of our windows. I yanked our router power cable out of the wall, but the alert remained a dead sentence that wouldn't vanish. I looked back at the feed and saw Mark's face tilt slightly, listening as if he could hear the moment I unplugged it. He smiled. Then he raised 2 fingers to his eyes and pointed them toward our bedroom window with slow precision. My wife came into the hallway and whispered that she heard something on the roof again, soft, careful steps. I checked the camera feed and saw Mark still on his platform, motionless watching. At the base of the platform ladder in the snow, there were no footprints except Mark's. Yet the motion box on the lower edge of the frame crawled toward our fence line in short bursts. Stop, start, stop, like something moving low and close, where the camera couldn't prove it. In the middle of the night, with the platform looming and the roof sounds returning, I finally understood what the structure really was. Not just a place to watch from, but a place to launch from. A perk, a vantage point, a statement that he didn't need to trespass to invade us. He could stand in his own yard and still reach into our house through angle and attention and whatever was moving beside him in the dark. At 330, she 3A. Mark climbed down the ladder and walked back toward his house without hurry, as if his shift was done. He stopped at his back door, turned and looked at our house one last time. He lifted his phone, not to film, but as if checking a message, and I felt a sick certainty that he was reading something about us in real time. Our cameras, our lights, our movements. Then he went inside. The platform remained empty and silent, but the camera feed still drew a faint motion box on the deck rail, hovering at the height of a face, as if something else had stayed up there, after Mark left standing perfectly still, watching our windows through the falling snow. I learned what real privacy invasion feels like the night my wife changed into a fresh pair of pajamas, and someone who shouldn't have been able to see her proved they could. It was 3:08 a.m., the kind of hour when your brain is already primed to believe the house is alive, and we were doing everything right. Now, blackout curtains, privacy film, no standing near windows, phones powered down when we talked router, unplugged at night, every room checked twice, like a ritual. My wife went into the bathroom with the door closed, the one room we still told ourselves was safe because it had no window that faced Mark's platform. I stayed in the hallway listening for the normal sounds of fabric water running, the small, everyday proof that life could still be ordinary. Then my phone buzzed on the floor where I'd left it face down because I'd kept it powered on only for emergency calls. One buzz, then a second. The screen lit up with a text from an unknown number, and my stomach tightened before I even read it because my body recognized the pattern. Now the message always arrived right after a decision. right after an action, like a hand closing, around the back of my neck. The text was 5 words, no greeting, no threat, just a statement that made my skin go cold. I like your new pajamas. I stared at it until the letters blurred. My wife hadn't come out of the bathroom yet. She hadn't told me what she'd put on. She hadn't posted anything. We hadn't bought them online. There was no digital trail that could explain a stranger commenting on fabric she'd changed into 30 seconds ago behind a locked door. My mouth went dry, as if my body was trying to stop itself from making sound. I knocked softly and said her name, and when she opened the door a crack, I showed her the screen. The color drained from her face so quickly it looked like someone had pulled a plug. How she whispered, and the word wasn't a question as much as a plea for physics to reassert itself. Another buzz came immediately. Same unknown number. And this one was worse, because it wasn't just proof of seeing, it was proof of angle. Left sleeve is inside out. My wife's hand went to her arm, fingers fumbling at the cuff, and I watched her eyes widen when she felt the folded fabric. She hadn't noticed it herself. Whoever texted had. She backed away from the bathroom like the tile floor had turned into a trap, and I felt the old fury rise sharp and useless. I didn't reply. I didn't call Mark. I didn't run outside. I did the only thing that made sense. In a house where every normal response had become part of someone else's experiment, I started hunting for the point of view. I walked into the bathroom and stood where my wife had been standing, and I looked at every surface like it could be a lens, the mirror, the vent, fan, the smoke detector we'd already replaced, the light fixture, the tiny gap under the cabinet lip. Nothing obvious. No blinking LED. No plastic bead. No wire. Just clean surfaces and the hum of the vent, like a throat clearing. Then my phone buzzed again, and this time the text wasn't clever. It was simple, almost tender in its cruelty. Don't look for it. I felt my jaw lock, because that sentence confirmed the worst part. He wasn't guessing. He was watching me search. He could see me standing in my own bathroom, turning in slow circles. He knew exactly how far behind I was. My wife stood in the hallway with her arms crossed tight over her chest, as if she could physically close herself off, and I realized the bathroom wasn't safe, because it had no window. It wasn't safe, because the house itself had openings we'd never treated, as entrances, vents, ducts, seams, spaces between walls where air moved and eyes could follow. I climbed onto the toilet lid, and aimed my flashlight into the vent fan housing. The beam caught dust, metal fins, and a thin dark line that didn't belong, something thread-like tucked along the edge. I reached in with 2 fingers and pulled gently, and a hair-thin cable slid out longer than it should have been, coated in a greasy film like it had been living in the dark for weeks. It wasn't a normal electrical wire. It was too delicate, too intentional. I pulled more, and felt it resist, like a fishing line snagged on a hook. My breath caught as I understood what I was holding. A fiber optic camera cable, the kind used for inspections, the kind that can carry an image from a space you can't fit into. Someone had fed it through our ventilation ductwork until the tip sat just inside the fan housing, aimed downward. A peephole made of light. My wife made a sound behind me, and I stopped pulling. Because if the cable was connected to something active yanking, it could be exactly what the person on the other end wanted. Proof we'd found it. Proof we were desperate. Instead, I taped it to the fan housing with shaking hands like pinning a snake and climbed down. I called the same technician we'd hired before, the one with the RF detector and the calm voice. But at 3 the call went to voicemail. I called the police and said very carefully, "We have a camera line inside our bathroom vent." The dispatcher asked if there was an intruder in the house. I said I didn't know, and that answer tasted like blood. While I waited, the text stopped for a full minute, long enough for me to feel the sick relief of silence. Then my wife's phone buzzed even though she'd powered it off earlier. The screen lit up on its own, and for a second I thought I was watching a ghost. A message appeared not from a number, but from unknown, like the phone itself had decided to speak. It read, "Turn off the fan." My wife's hand trembled over the device. She looked at me and I could see the argument happening behind her eyes. Don't obey, but also, if we don't obey, what happens? The fan hummed on above us, constant, and I realized the hum wasn't just ventilation anymore. It was cover white noise that made a whispered breath harder to place. I stepped under the switch and flipped the fan off. The bathroom went suddenly brutally quiet. In that quiet, we heard it so faint it could have been imagination, if we hadn't been trained to doubt ourselves, a soft scrape in the duct above the fan, like something being pulled back through metal, careful and slow. The taped fiber line twitched once under the flashlight beam, then went still. My phone buzzed one final time with a text that didn't sound like a threat until you understood how deeply it reached. Thank you. Police arrived 15 minutes later and found no one inside the house. They stared at the vent and listened to my explanation with that careful, contained expression I'd come to hate. They took photos. They took notes. They told me to call an HVAC company. They told me to seal the duct. They told me again that without proof of who installed it, there wasn't much they could do. After they left, my wife sat on the living room floor with her knees to her chest, staring at nothing, and I stood in the bathroom holding the fiber line like it was a live nerve. I didn't know where it went. That was the problem. The house had veins, and someone next door had learned how to thread a camera through them like a needle. As dawn crawled in, I finally followed the only clue we had: the direction of the cable. I opened the vent grill in the hallway outside the bathroom and aimed my flashlight inside. Far back, beyond where air should turn, I saw a faint glint like plastic. Another line. Another route. The ducts weren't just ducts. They were pathways, and whatever was on the other end wasn't satisfied with watching from a platform anymore. It had moved into the walls. That night, when my wife refused to change clothes anywhere in the house, except with the lights off and a blanket around her shoulders, my phone buzzed once softly, like a polite cough, and the text said, "Doesn't matter." By the time we discovered the tunnel, the idea of inside and outside had already been ruined, so the sight of a man-sized passage connecting our basement to something beyond didn't shock me at first. It just made the fear finally settle into a shape I could touch. It happened at 317 a.m. On a night so cold, the house popped and creaked like it was shrinking around us. I was half asleep on the mattress in the dining room when I heard the basement, not a bang or a crash, just a slow, muffled thump like someone shifting weight on packed dirt. Then, another closer, as if the sound was traveling along a hollow space beneath the floor. My wife's eyes snapped open. We listened, holding our breath, and I felt that damp soil smell creep up through the vents. Again faint, but unmistakable, like a cellar door opening somewhere you couldn't see. I grabbed the flashlight and went down, not because I believed I could stop whatever was happening, but because the not knowing was worse than the danger. The basement was colder than it should have been, and the air moved in a way basements don't when they're sealed. The shelving unit by the hidden vent had been nudged again, only an inch, but the dust pattern on the concrete proved it had moved recently, like a chair pulled out and pushed back. I shoved it aside completely this time, no pretending, no half measures. The vent cover was gone. The concrete seam we'd noticed for weeks, the rectangle that looked like someone had traced a door into our foundation, was no longer a subtle line. It was open. A narrow gap, black as a throat, ran along one edge, wide enough for fingers. I knelt and aimed the flashlight beam into it, and the light poured into a space that swallowed it, revealing rough wood framing and packed soil beyond, not the solid stone and rebar a foundation should have. The smell hit me full force, then wet earth, and something else, something metallic and sour like old sweat. I called my wife down, and she stood at the bottom step with her arms wrapped around herself, refusing to get closer, eyes fixed on the black gap like it could blink. I wedged the flat end of a crowbar into the seam and pulled. The concrete didn't crumble like a random crack. It lifted like a lid. A slab shifted outward with a groan, and beneath it was a framed opening squared off with lumber leading into a crawl space that had been expanded into a passage. A tunnel, not a natural hollow, not a broken drain, but something made the sides reinforced with plywood. The floor tamped flat strips of carpet, stapled along the lower edges like padding, the exact same beige as our living room rug. My stomach rolled because the detail was intimate, like someone had decorated a route into our home with pieces of us. 10 feet in the tunnel widened enough to crawl comfortably, and along the wall ran a power cable. stapled neatly every foot, leading deeper into darkness. I followed it with my light and saw the first object that made my hands go numb. One of my wife's missing socks crumpled on the dirt like it had been dropped in a hurry. Then a snapped plastic button. Then tucked into a small niche in the wall, like a shrine, to routine a lineup of items in a neat row. Our spare mailbox key. A dog tag. We'd thought we lost a torn corner of a photo. Printer twist tie from a bread bag. A small vial of hand. Sanitizer we'd never bought. Trash turned into trophies. Evidence turned into collection. My wife whispered from behind me, "Don't go in there." But I was already halfway past the point where my body understood it should run, because I could hear something deeper inside the tunnel now. Not footsteps, but the soft scrape of movement, like fabric against dirt, slow and controlled, the way someone moves when they know you're listening. I backed away from the opening and raised my flashlight to the ceiling joists, trying to find a reason to stop, trying to anchor myself to the solid house above. And that's when I saw the fresh scratches on the underside of the subfloor. Directly over the tunnel mouth, 4 parallel lines, like fingernails, testing wood. This tunnel wasn't old. It was active. It was used. My phone buzzed upstairs, where I'd left it on the dining room mattress, and the sound was muffled, but unmistakable. A reminder that no matter where I stood, he could reach me through a screen. I didn't check it. I couldn't. I kept my eyes on the tunnel, like if I looked away, it would breathe. Then from inside the darkness, a voice drifted toward us, low and calm, not echoing the way voices do in open space, but close, as if the speaker's mouth was only a few feet inside. "Don't shine it here." The words were gentle, almost polite, and the horror wasn't the command. It was the familiarity of the voice. "Mark." My wife made a small broken sound and retreated up the stairs, and I stayed kneeling at the opening because my legs wouldn't obey. "Mark," I said, forcing the name out like a dare. "Get out of my house." There was a pause, and then a soft laugh that didn't sound amused as much as pleased. "This part isn't your house," he replied. "This part is between." The flashlight beam trembled in my hand, and as it shook, I caught movement deep in the tunnel. Not a full body, just the suggestion of one. A dark shape shifting behind the plywood. Support too smooth to be a rat, too tall to be a dog. The power cable along the wall pulsed faintly, as if something had drawn current, and a small LED deep in the passage flicked on and off like an eye trying to focus. I scrambled backward, slammed the concrete slab toward the opening, and it thudded down imperfectly, leaving a thin gap that still breathed cold air. I shoved the shelving unit back over it, not because it would stop anything, but because I needed to pretend there was a barrier. Any barrier. Upstairs, my wife was crying into her hands, whispering that we had to leave. We had to leave right now, and I nodded because I could feel how thin our options were becoming. We threw clothes into a bag, grabbed keys, and rushed to the front door. The door wouldn't open. The deadbolt turned, the handle moved, but the door stayed sealed, as if someone had pressed their full weight against it from the outside. My wife screamed, and I felt the floor under my feet vibrate with a muffled thump from below, like someone had bumped the underside of the house with a shoulder. Then from somewhere inside the walls, a sound traveled upward, through ducts and studs, faint but clear in the silence. The slow, deliberate rhythm of crawling. Dunk, drag, dunk, drag, circling not outside the house but under it, as if the tunnel had become a hallway, and we were the ones trapped behind glass. My phone buzzed again with a text I didn't want to read, but the screen lit up in my hand anyway, and the message was a single sentence that turned my blood to ice, because it proved the tunnel wasn't just a way in. It was a way to control where we went. The front door is for guests. The front door didn't open, not even after the deadbolt clicked, and the handle went limp in my hand like it had given up. I shoved my shoulder into it once, then twice, feeling the hard refusal on the other side, the sensation of a body pressing back without making a sound. My wife kept whispering we had to leave right now, but the house had turned into a sealed container, and the worst part was how polite it felt. No broken lock, no splintered frame, just a quiet decision made somewhere outside. our control. Then, from the living room, a soft metallic clink snapped through the silence. The mail slot. We'd forgotten the mail slot. Our front door had one of those old-fashioned brass flaps, the kind I'd never used because everything comes to the porch these days. But now, it sounded like the only moving part the night had left us. Clink, clink. A slow test, as if someone was lifting it a quarter inch and letting it fall, learning the rhythm of our fear. I stepped away from the door and moved down the hallway with my flashlight, keeping my body low, feeling ridiculous for thinking a beam of light mattered to someone who could thread cameras through vents. The clink came again, and this time it was followed by something else. A long, soft scrape, like fingernails, on the inside edge of the slot, tracing the outline. My wife grabbed my sleeve and shook her head hard, pleading without words. I didn't listen because the sound was already inside my head, and I needed to see if it was real. I edged into the living room and aimed the flashlight at the door from 10 feet away, not close enough to be grabbed, not close enough to be breathed on. The brass flap lifted slowly from the outside, opening like an eyelid. For a second, there was only darkness behind it, a thin slit of night. Then something pale filled the gap, and my skin went cold, because it wasn't a hand. It was an eye. Not a reflection, not a trick of light. An actual human eye pressed close to the slot, blinking once as it adjusted to the flashlight. The pupil tightened, then widened calm and unhurried, as if whoever owned it had all the time in the world to study my living room. I froze so hard my lungs forgot how to move. The eye shifted left, then right, scanning, and I realized, with a sick clarity, that the mail slot wasn't just a way to see in. It was a way to confirm where we were standing, to count our distance from the door, to pick the moment when a barrier mattered least. My wife made a small sound behind me, and the eye snapped toward her instantly, like it had been waiting for a voice. The flap lowered halfway, then lifted again, and something slid through the opening with a soft, papery whisper. An envelope fell onto the doormat inside our house. No stamp, no address, just thick, white paper, the kind you use when you want something to feel official. The eye remained in the slot, watching to see if I'd pick it up. My wife whispered, "Don't touch it," but the envelope was already a hook in the room, and I knew if I didn't take it now it would sit there and rot in my mind. I walked toward it slowly, never taking my beam off the slot. The eye didn't move. It watched me the way Mark watched me from his platform, patient, certain, as if my steps were already part of a plan. I crouched, pinched the envelope by the corner, and flipped it open without bringing it close to my face, expecting powder blades, anything. Inside was a single sheet folded once. Clean print. One sentence you can leave through the basement. My stomach dropped because it wasn't a suggestion. It was a map. A reminder that the tunnel wasn't just his entrance, it was the route he wanted us to take. The brass flap clicked again, and the eye withdrew, slightly replaced by a thin dark shape that pushed into the slot, something narrow and rigid. A camera lens. A tiny lens on the end of a stick, sliding into my living room by inches, swiveling left and right like a periscope. My wife let out a broken sob and the lens pivoted toward her, immediately locking onto her like it could taste her panic. I stepped forward on instinct, raising the flashlight to blind it, and in that instant the stick extended farther, bold now, as if my reaction had been the confirmation it needed. The lens stopped inches past, the brass flap, and a soft whisper came through the slit so close it felt like it traveled directly into my ear, through the air wave. It was Mark's voice, gentle, amused. I didn't move. The lens stayed waiting. My wife whispered my name, begging me not to engage, but the whisper through the slot came again, still calm, still polite. "Wave, so I know you're okay." The cruelty was in the phrasing and how it pretended concern, while turning obedience into proof. I stepped back instead, and the lens tracked my movements smoothly, like a trained animal following a hand signal. Then it did something that made my blood run icy. It angled downward and focused on the floor near the doormat, then on the envelope in my hand, then back up toward my face, as if it wanted to record that I'd received the message that I'd read. To it that I'd understood the route. The slot flap lifted a little higher, and for a second I saw more than an eye outside. I saw a sliver of cheek pale in the streetlight, and the curve of a smile that wasn't frightened of being seen. My wife backed into the kitchen, whispering we should call 911, and I almost laughed at the idea of calling anyone while an eye stared into our house through a brass mouth. I did it anyway, hands shaking, and the moment the dispatcher answered, the lens froze as if it were listening to my words through the gap. I didn't say neighbor. I didn't say Mark. I said, "Someone is looking into our home through the mail slot right now." The dispatcher told me to stay away from the door. I was already away. The dispatcher asked if the person was trying to enter. The brass flap lifted wider, and the lens pushed in another inch, like an answer. My wife whispered that the basement door seal tape was torn again. I stared at the mail slot and felt the trap tighten. Front door, sealed basement offered mail slot watching, and beneath it all the steady knowledge that he could choose where we ran. The whisper came one more time, softer, now intimate, as if he were standing inches from the brass. Guests used the door. Then the lens withdrew. The eye vanished. The flap fell shut with a final click. Outside, no footsteps retreated. No snow crunched. Just silence. The kind that makes you realize the person outside didn't hurry because they didn't need to. When police arrived, they found nothing but an ordinary brass mail slot and an envelope on my floor. They told me to install a cover to replace the door, to add a camera. I almost screamed at the word camera. After they left, I stood in my living room staring at the slot, and in the faint reflection of the brass, I saw my own eye staring back, wide, exhausted, trapped, and I understood the true invasion. He didn't need to break in anymore. He'd found a way to make my house look outward, to make me watch myself being watched. At 3, 4, 5, 1, M. The brass flap lifted once more, just a hair. Not enough to see an eye. Only enough to let a thin strip of winter air slide inside like a breath, and in that breath, I heard the quietest sound, so small it could have been imagined if I hadn't. You learned better the faint click of a camera shutter from the other side. Taking a picture of the moment I finally stepped back, defeated from my own front door. The next morning we covered the mail slot with a bolted metal plate, the kind you buy when you've stopped caring what looks normal. We added weather stripping, extra locks, a door bar, anything that made the front entry feel less like a mouth. We told ourselves the bathroom was safer now, because we'd taped the vent fan shut and sealed every grill we could reach. But safety had become a superstition, and superstitions don't hold up under water pressure. Bydwa 55. A.M. That night, my wife couldn't take it anymore, and said she needed a shower, not for comfort, but for control, for the simple human proof that her body still belonged to her. I stayed outside the bathroom door with a flashlight and a kitchen knife. I didn't believe in listening to the water start, trying to keep my breathing quiet because the house felt like it had ears. The shower ran for less than 2 minutes before my phone buzzed with a new alert from a device we hadn't installed. Airspace, motion detected. I stared at the words, as if they might rearrange into something sensible. Then from outside, I heard it, a thin electric whine, distant at first, like a mosquito trapped in winter, growing louder as it approached the house. The sound came from above, not the street, and my skin prickled as I realized it wasn't footsteps I needed to fear now. It was something that didn't touch the ground. I ran to the back window in the hallway and lifted the blackout curtain a fraction, just enough to see without giving my full face to the glass. Over Mark's yard, a small drone hovered under the snow-heavy sky. Its lights dimmed, its body dark against the night, holding itself steady like it knew exactly how to fight the wind. It moved with slow precision toward our house, pausing once as if checking a signal, then sliding forward again. The platform in Mark's yard stood empty beneath it, but the drone didn't need the platform. It was the platform. It approached the upstairs bathroom window, the one with privacy film, the one we'd told ourselves couldn't be seen through, and stopped directly outside the frosted pane. Hovering so close, its rotors made the falling snow swirl like a halo. The bathroom light was on behind that film, turning my wife into a soft shadow shape, and the drone angled itself, adjusting, searching for whatever angle or sensor could turn a shadow into detail. My mouth went dry. I moved toward the bathroom door, ready to tell her to stop, to cover up, to run, and then the drone's speaker crackled softly, and a voice emerged calm and familiar. Not Mark's this time, but mine. The smooth, patient version from the recorder, saying, "Don't shut it off." The words weren't shouted. They were delivered like instructions in a tutorial video. I froze, with my hand inches from the doorknob. Inside, my wife heard it too. The shower water faltered for a second, then resumed faster, like she'd turned it hotter in panic. The drone shifted an inch closer to the glass, and my phone buzzed with another text from an unknown number. Steam makes it clearer. I felt sick, because it was true. Moisture, on film the right angle, a thermal sensor. There were 100 ways to see what a human eye couldn't. I grabbed the hallway light switch and snapped it off, plunging the corridor into darkness, hoping darkness would break the view. The drone outside didn't care. It held position, as if it had night vision better than mine, as if it was designed for exactly this. The speaker crackled again, and this time it played audio. I recognized with a punch of dread my wife's voice from earlier that day, muffled, saying, "I can't do this anymore." The recording cut replaced by my voice answering, "We'll leave tomorrow." The drone was playing our private conversation back to us, like a lullaby, proof it had been listening, even after we sealed the slot and unplugged the router. Proof that somewhere, some device still lived inside our house, or along the tunnel, carrying our words outward. I ran to the living room, yanked open the curtain by the smallest amount, and saw the drone's silhouette reflected in the glass as it hovered outside the upstairs bathroom. Across the cul-de-sac, Mark's upstairs window glowed faintly, and I could just make out his shape, standing behind blinds, watching the drone's position like a pilot watching a screen. My wife screamed my name from inside the bathroom, and the sound cut through me. I slammed my shoulder against the bathroom door, shouting for her to shut off the light, to wrap a towel to get away from the window, and as I did, the drone outside rose, suddenly climbing higher, gaining a new angle toward the roofline. The rotors roared louder, pushing snow outward in a violent circle. Then the whine shifted direction as it moved along the eaves, searching, mapping the house from above, like it was tracing an outline for someone below. The speaker crackled one last time with my voice again, soft and satisfied. He's learning. The drone hovered over the roof peak for 3 seconds, perfectly still against the snow, then drifted back toward Mark's yard and dropped lower, disappearing behind the fence line as if landing somewhere hidden. The silence afterward was worse than the sound because it told me the drone wasn't a prank. It was a tool used and returned a device that could touch any window, any vent, any angle we hadn't thought to protect. My wife came out wrapped in a towel, shaking eyes wild, and she whispered, "It was right there." I nodded, staring at the ceiling, as if I could see through shingles. My phone buzzed again, and the message was simple, almost friendly. "Good shower." Then another, "Tomorrow is busy for you." My blood turned cold, because it wasn't a threat. It was scheduling the kind of certainty that comes from watching a person long enough to predict their next move. Outside, the winter night returned to stillness. But in that stillness, I could hear faint and distant the electric whine of rotors powering down somewhere nearby, like a toy being put away carefully for the next time it would be brought out, to prove that even steam and walls and locked doors couldn't stop a neighbor who had finally taken the sky. The text that said, "Tomorrow is busy for you," hit harder than any threat because it meant he wasn't improvising. He had a calendar for us. He had patterns. He had the kind of knowledge that only comes from watching long enough that your life stops feeling like yours and starts feeling like a schedule someone else can edit. The next morning, while the sun made the snow look harmless, I tried to prove him wrong by doing something random. I didn't follow routine. I didn't make coffee first. I didn't check the cameras. I grabbed my coat and said, "We were going to the store right now. No plan, no list, just movement." My wife's eyes flicked toward the windows, like she expected Mark's platform to be occupied even in daylight. We left anyway. The driveway felt too open, the sky too wide, like the house had become a spotlight, and stepping out was an audition. We got into the car, and for the first time in days, the engine sound felt like power. I backed out, slowly, scanning Mark's house. The blinds were closed. No silhouette, no wave. For a brief moment I felt almost stupid, like I'd been living in a spiral, and daylight was the antidote. Then my phone buzzed in the cup holder. A new text from an unknown number. Seatbelt. I glanced down without thinking and my stomach dropped, because my wife's belt wasn't clicked yet. She froze, hand hovering over the latch, and then she clicked it with a sharp snap that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet car. Another text arrived immediately. Thank you. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. We drove anyway. The grocery store was only 8 minutes away, a bright box of fluorescent safety, and I told myself crowds meant protection. But the moment we stepped into the parking lot, I felt that same sensation of a gaze landing on the back of my neck. The wind was cold, pushing loose snow across the asphalt in thin snakes, and above the store entrance a small drone hovered near a light pole, dark against grey sky, holding position like a patient insect. It wasn't close enough for me to read a serial number. It wasn't loud enough for anyone else to look up. It was just there, quietly insisting that distance didn't matter. My wife grabbed my sleeve, whispering, "Don't," and I understood what she meant. Don't look up. Don't confirm. You see it. Don't give it the pleasure. We walked inside, with our heads down. We tried to act normal. We picked up random items, anything to prove we weren't predictable. Milk, then cereal, then a bag of oranges we didn't need. I felt ridiculous and exhausted, but I kept doing it because the alternative was admitting we were trapped. Halfway down an aisle, my wife's phone buzzed, even though she'd kept it powered off. She stared at it like it had bitten her, and the screen lit with a single notification. Not a text, not a call, but a calendar alert that had never existed before. Appointment, 3:00 p.m. Home. My mouth went dry. Someone had added an event to her phone without unlocking it, or the phone was listening even when off, or the alert was coming from something impersonating a system notification. The effect was the same control through suggestion. My phone buzzed too. Another unknown text. You bought decaf last week. I almost laughed, because of course he remembered. Of course, he catalogued the details that made me feel small. Then, a third message arrived. Aisle 7. End cap. I stopped walking. My wife did too. The store noise wheels on tile fluorescent hum distant music suddenly felt far away. Aisle 7 was 2 aisles over. End cap meant the open display at the end, where anyone could stand and stare without looking like they were searching for you. I didn't want to go. I didn't want to confirm, but the pressure of not knowing was unbearable. I walked slow and controlled, pushing the cart like it was armor. When we reached aisle 7, my heart slammed, because at the end cap stood a man in a grey coat, hands in pockets, head slightly tilted like he was listening. Mark, in the middle of a grocery store in daylight, under fluorescent lights that should have made him look ordinary. He didn't wave. He didn't smile big. He just looked at me with that calm, patient expression like we were continuing a conversation that had started at 3 a.m. and never stopped. My wife whispered no, like she was trying to undo the moment. Mark's gaze drifted to her, then back to me. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, held it up between 2 fingers, the red-capped key, the one that had appeared in our living room. He rolled it in the light so the plastic cap caught a shine. Then he slipped it back into his pocket and turned away, walking toward the back of the store at an unhurried pace. He didn't need to chase us. He didn't need to block our path. He just needed to show he could be anywhere we were, that the world outside the house was still his perimeter. I stood frozen, and in that stillness my phone buzzed again. Another message. Don't make a scene. I swallowed hard and realized how true it was. If I screamed in the grocery store that my neighbor was stalking me, I'd become the spectacle. Mark would become the calm bystander. Everyone would look at me like I was the unstable one. That was part of the design. My wife's hand shook on the cart handle, and I felt the shame of being managed in public. We abandoned the cart and left the store without buying anything. We drove home in silence, the drone still hovering above the parking lot in my mind like a dark punctuation mark. When we pulled into our driveway, another text arrived. Good trip. Then, as if to prove the trip had always been permitted, not escaped, a final message. Now you're back where you belong. The words made me taste bile. That night, at 2:59 a.m., before any alert could buzz, our front porch light turned on by itself, bright and steady. And through the crack in the curtain, I saw Mark standing on his platform in the snow, watching our house, like he was waiting for us to settle back into the routine he'd written for us. After the grocery store, we stopped pretending we could outrandom him. We stopped telling ourselves we'll leave tomorrow, because tomorrow had become a word he owned. We made a plan. A real plan. Pack essentials. Drive to a hotel in a different town. Contact a lawyer. File for a restraining order. Request a welfare check. Anything that turned our fear into paperwork, because paperwork was the only language the completed world took seriously. By late afternoon, we had bags ready by the dining room mattress, and the car backed into the driveway for a quick exit. It was still light out when my wife finally said, "We should check the basement one last time," and I hated that she was right. If the tunnel was open, if he'd left something, if he'd sabotaged the furnace, the car, the locks, we needed to know. I went down with a flashlight and a heavy wrench, feeling like a character in a movie who makes the obvious mistake. The basement air was colder than upstairs, and that damp soil smell was stronger, as if someone had opened the earth and let it breathe. The shelving unit was shifted again. This time there was no attempt to hide it. The hidden concrete slab was pushed aside enough to expose the tunnel mouth, like a grin. I aimed my flashlight into it, and saw fresh scrape marks on the plywood edges, clean lines where something had passed through recently. Then I saw the new detail that made my skin go numb. Little bits of snow scattered just inside the tunnel entrance, melting into dark spots on the packed dirt. Snow doesn't get underground on its own. Someone had come from outside. Someone had brought winter in with them. I backed away, pulse hammering, and that's when I heard the sound from deeper in the tunnel. A soft, rhythmic crunch, slow and steady like boots stepping on snow, except it was coming from beneath my house. Crunch, pause, crunch, pause. As if someone were walking carefully to keep their balance. The sound moved closer. I froze, flashlight beam trembling. My wife called my name from upstairs and I didn't answer, because I didn't want to give my location to the mouth and the floor. The crunch came again, closer now, and with it a faint, rasping breath. Not panicked, not tired, but controlled, like someone exerting themselves quietly. Then a voice drifted out of the tunnel, low and amused, packing Mark. The single word hit me like a slap. I forced my voice steady. "Yes," I said. "We're leaving." A soft chuckle came from the darkness, and the crunching footsteps stopped, as if the speaker had paused to enjoy the moment. "You can," Mark said calmly, "but you won't." My hands tightened around the wrench. "Get out," I said louder. "I'm calling the police." Mark laughed again, and this time the laugh echoed slightly, confirming the tunnel's depth, confirming the fact that his voice was inside the space beneath my home like it belonged there. "Cole," he said. "They'll arrive after you. Decide." The flashlight beam caught movement, then a pale shape sliding along the tunnel floor, low, not upright. Something on all fours. It moved into the edge of the light and stopped, and for a heartbeat my brain refused to label it as human because it was too smooth, too controlled. Then I saw a face. Not Mark's. A blank, pale, mask-like face, featureless in the glare, like the smooth oval I'd glimpsed in the porch feed when my smart home died. The face tilted slightly, listening. My throat locked. Behind that face, deeper in the tunnel, Mark's voice continued, gentle coaxing. "He's ready." The blank face shifted forward a few inches, and the sound under it changed from dirt scrape to a soft, wet slide, like skin on damp earth. My survival instincts finally punched through paralysis. I backed up fast, slammed the concrete slab toward the opening, and felt my hands shake as I shoved the shelving unit over it with all my weight. The slab didn't seal. Cold air still leaked through the seam like breath. Above me, the basement light flickered once, as if someone had touched a switch somewhere along the line. Then I heard it faint, but unmistakable scratching from the underside of the slab, slow and deliberate, like fingernails tracing concrete. I stumbled up the stairs and slammed the basement door, ripping the painter's tape we'd reapplied like it was paper. My wife was waiting at the top step, with her bag in hand, eyes wide. "We go now," she said, voice shaking. I nodded, and we moved fast. Coats, keys, the car door. We didn't look at Mark's house. We didn't look at the platform. We just tried to get to the driver's seat before the night could rearrange itself. My hand closed around the car door handle, and the handle lifted like normal. Then the door refused to open, the same quiet refusal as the front door the night before, as if a hand had pressed from the inside. I yanked harder. Nothing. My wife tried her side. Nothing. The car was locked. I clicked the fob. The lights flashed. The doors stayed sealed. My wife whispered no, and her voice cracked. Then my phone buzzed with a text so casual it felt like mockery. Cars are for going places. Another buzz immediately. You're not going anywhere. I looked up and saw Mark on his platform, silhouetted against the dusk hands on the rail, watching our driveway. He lifted his hand and made a slow twisting motion, turning a key, and at that exact moment inside our car, the dashboard lights flickered on, then off, as if the vehicle had responded to an invisible command. The dread that rose in my chest wasn't just fear anymore. It was the understanding that he had extended the tunnel's logic to everything we relied on. Locks, phones, schedules, and now, the car. He wasn't just watching us. He was managing our exits. Behind me, from inside the house, came a soft metallic clink, the newly covered mail slot plate vibrating as if something had tapped it from the other side. Then, from below the floorboards, the slow crawling rhythm began, again, not loud, but steady. Thunk, drag, thunk, drag, moving under the house toward the front, like something repositioning itself. My wife grabbed my hand and pulled me back from the car, eyes wild, whispering, "Where do we go?" And for the first time since we moved in, I had no answer, because every route outward, front door basement car, had been turned into a choice he could approve or deny. The only thing left was to stay still and wait for the next instruction, and the thought made me sick because it meant the plan had already worked. A tres presece. My phone buzzed, even though I'd turned off every app notification I could find, and the screen lit with a single line that didn't come from a number, just the kind of system-style banner. You can't block garage. Open. For one stupid second I thought it was ours, then I realized we don't have a garage. Mark does. Across the cul-de-sac, his house sat dark and quiet under fresh snow, and yet a pale rectangle of light had appeared where his garage door should be, as if the building had opened its mouth. I moved to the upstairs window and lifted the blackout curtain a hair just enough to see without showing my whole face, and my stomach tightened because Mark's garage door was halfway up, rising, slowly, motor humming, so softly it felt like the sound was coming from inside my own walls. He wasn't standing there. No silhouette, no robe, no mug, no friendly wave. The garage was just open, brightly lit, like a store display that wanted customers. My wife whispered my name from behind me, and the fear in her voice made me hate how quickly my brain turned the open door into an instruction. My phone buzzed again. A text this time. Unknown number. Simple and clean. You wanted proof. I didn't reply. I couldn't. I just stared at the open garage across the street, while snow drifted through the light and fell onto the concrete like ash. The camera feed on my phone drew a motion box inside the garage, even though I couldn't see a body, as if something stood just out of my sightline waiting. Then the box slid forward, and I realized with a sick lurch that someone was moving around inside Mark's garage, but whatever it was didn't reflect the night vision the way a person should. A third message arrived. Look. Mark's garage light brightened slightly, like someone had turned a dimmer up, and the inside became clearer. Along the back wall, directly facing the open door, was a chair, placed perfectly in line with our house. Not a folding chair. A cushioned dining chair, clean and deliberate, positioned like a seat at a theater. Behind it, taped across the wall, were photos. Dozens of them. Some printed on glossy paper, some plain. Some black and white, night vision stills. My chest went cold as I recognized the angles. Our porch, our driveway, our bedroom, the dining room mattress, the bathroom door, my wife stepping out, wrapped in a towel, my own face lit by my phone in the basement, screenshots of camera feeds, screenshots of texts, images taken from inside our house. The wall wasn't random. It was curated, arranged in rows like a timeline. On one section I saw a handwritten heading in thick marker, "The Statue in the Snow," with 3 timestamps beneath it. Another section read, "Midnight Activities." Another read, "Invasion of Privacy." My throat tightened because it wasn't just that he'd been watching. He'd been organizing the watching into chapters, like our fear was a project. The garage door kept rising until it was fully open, and the light spilled onto the snow like a stage spotlight. In the center of the garage floor, directly under that light, there was a shape covered with a white sheet. The sheet wasn't draped casually. It was tucked corners, squared, like someone making a bed. My wife whispered, "Don't," but my body had already leaned closer to the glass, chasing the need to understand the shape. The sheet shifted slightly, not in the wind, but like something underneath had been touched. Then the sheet slid back by itself, slow and smooth, revealing what was under it. A mannequin, full-sized, dressed in my clothes. My grey hoodie with the frayed cuff, my jeans, my boots. The mannequin's head was a blank, white oval, with no features, the same pale face I'd seen at the tunnel mouth, but someone had taped a printed photo over it, my face taken from a distance. Slightly blurred mouth, half open like I'd been, mid-sentence. The tape lines were neat, pressed flat, like a crafts project. Around the mannequin's neck hung a key ring with several keys, including the red-capped key. On the mannequin's chest, pinned like a name tag, was a strip of paper that said in block letters, "Guest." I felt my stomach drop, because it was the same word Mark had used when he whispered through the mail slot. Guests use the door. I turned away from the window and gagged into my sleeve, not because I was dramatic, but because my body had finally hit the point where it couldn't carry the fear without trying to expel it. My wife was shaking. "Call," she whispered. "Call right now." I did. I told the dispatcher my neighbor's garage was open, and inside was what looked like a shrine made of photos of us and our property. I said the word shrine because it was the only word that fit. Officers arrived faster than usual, probably because Stalker wall of photos sounds more actionable than motion box around nothing, and I watched from my window as they crossed the street and approached Mark's open garage. For a moment I felt relief, the weak kind that comes from seeing uniforms and flashlights, but it died instantly when I saw the way the officers slowed at the threshold, like the air itself changed near the open door. One officer raised his light and swept it across the photo wall. Even from across the street, I saw his posture tighten. He stepped inside, then stopped staring at the mannequin wearing my clothes. The second officer followed, head turning slowly, taking it all in. They spoke into radios, quiet, controlled. The lights of a third unit appeared at the end of the street. I thought, finally, this is evidence that survives daylight. Then the garage lights blinked once, and every printed photo on the wall fluttered as if a gust had moved through, even though there was no wind inside. The officers both turned, scanning, and for a second they looked not at the wall, but at the chair facing our house, like they could feel the intention of it. One officer stepped toward the mannequin and lifted the key ring with gloved fingers. He held it up to the light. I couldn't hear his words, but I saw his mouth form something like, "Where did you get these?" Because at that exact moment, Mark's back door opened, and Mark walked into view from inside his house, wearing a robe and holding a mug, calm as always. He stopped at the edge of his driveway and stared at the officers in his garage, as if he'd woken up to find strangers rummaging through his things. He didn't look surprised by the open door. He didn't look angry. He looked mildly inconvenienced, like a man whose neighbors were loud. One officer approached him and spoke. Mark gestured toward the garage with his mug hand, a lazy motion like, "Go ahead," and I watched him tilt his head toward our upstairs window just slightly, as if checking whether we were watching the moment his plan became official. The officer led Mark to the garage entrance. Mark glanced at the mannequin, then at the wall of photos, and smiled, faintly. Not embarrassed, not defensive, almost proud. He said something, and the officer's shoulders squared, like he didn't like the answer. The second officer came out, holding an evidence bag. I saw a familiar item inside it. My wife's pajama top with the small white stars. Real physical ours. Another bag contained the tiny microphone capsule from our porch. Another had the fiber optic cable tip. For the first time, The officers had objects they could hold, not just stories we told. The lead officer spoke into his radio again, and I watched Mark's face while he listened. Mark didn't panic. He didn't protest. He just stared at our house, over the officer's shoulder, eyes steady, patient, like he was waiting for the next step we'd take. Then, without warning, the garage door started to lower on its own motor, humming softly. The officers spun, one of them reaching out as if to stop it, and the door paused halfway down, like it had heard the gesture. The light inside the garage dimmed, not off, just lower, as if the room were trying to become less visible. Mark's smile widened a fraction. I saw it clearly, even from across the street. He wasn't closing the door to hide the shrine from police. He was closing it to show he could still move parts of the world without touching them. The officer barked something at him. Mark raised both hands, mug, still, in one expression, innocent. The garage door stopped and slowly reversed, rising again, like an apology. The officers exchanged a look, and in that look I saw the thing that made my blood turn cold. They understood this was abnormal, but they didn't have a category for it. They had laws for trespassing, stalking, harassment, theft. They didn't have a statute for a neighbor who could open doors with the air and watch you change clothes through ducts. They talked to Mark longer. They took more photos. They carried out more bags. They told Mark to stay available. They told us they'd pursue next steps. Mark remained calm the entire time, never once looking at the police car lights with fear, only looking at our windows with attention. When the officers finally left, Mark stood alone in his driveway and lifted his mug in a small toast toward our house. My phone buzzed with one final text that night. Now you've seen it. Then, a second. At 3:00 a.m. You'll see me. I didn't sleep. I sat by the window with the curtain barely cracked, staring at the empty snow between our houses, waiting for the figure to appear because I finally understood the shrine wasn't the threat. It was the invitation. It was proof he'd built a place for us in his world, and now he wanted us to meet him in it. At 2:00 a.m. The snow outside looked freshly, poured smooth and bright under the streetlight, and my whole body felt like a held breath. I didn't wait for a notification. I didn't wait for the camera to lie to me with a motion box. I just watched the yard through a sliver of curtain like I'd been doing since the first night we moved in, except now the fear had a destination. 3:00 a.m. hit, and he was there. Exactly where the melt circle had been weeks ago, standing under the streetlight in my yard, as if he'd been placed there. Mark, thick coat, hat low, hands at his sides, face angled straight toward our kitchen window. No movement, no pacing, not even the tiny sway of someone fighting cold. Snow fell and gathered on his shoulders, and he didn't shake it off. My wife sat behind me on the dining room mattress, whispering my name like a warning. But I didn't look away because this was what he'd promised, the neighbor who stares. I opened the camera app, and the motion box locked onto him instantly, the cleanest detection we'd had in days, as if the software finally recognized something it could admit was real. I hit record on my phone screen, not because I trusted evidence anymore, but because I needed the ritual of documenting to keep my hands from shaking apart. Mark didn't react to the glow of our house, didn't react to my movement behind the curtain. He just stared, as if the act of looking was the entire purpose of his body. I whispered to my wife to call 911, and she did, voice trembling, telling the dispatcher that Mark was in our yard, again, standing motionless, refusing to leave. The dispatcher told us to stay inside. I almost laughed. Inside and outside had become meaningless. I watched Mark for 4 minutes without him moving at all. And during those 4 minutes, my brain did the thing it always does. When fear becomes repetitive, it started trying to find a rational explanation. Drugs, mental illness, some obsession that could be explained with a file and a court order. But then Mark lifted his hand slowly, not to wave, not to threaten, just to touch his own eyelid, and I realized with a sick lurch that he hadn't blinked once since he appeared. Not a single blink. His eyes were open in the snowfall, like glass. He lowered his hand and kept staring, and I felt my skin prickle because the lack of blinking wasn't just creepy. It was effort, like he was training himself, like he was proving he could outlast my discomfort. I did the stupidest thing, the thing every rational part of me screamed not to do. I turned on the backyard floodlights. The white light snapped on, blasting the yard, flattening the snow into hard shadows. Mark's face became visible enough for me to see the details I'd avoided. Cheeks, pale lips, relaxed eyes, wide and dry-looking, fixed directly on our window. He didn't flinch. He didn't squint. He didn't even seem bothered by the glare. He smiled faintly, and that smile felt like a hook, sliding under my ribs. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number while I watched him. "Come outside." I didn't reply. I didn't move. Mark's mouth opened, and even through the glass, even without opening a window, I heard his voice as if it were in the room with me, low and calm, like he'd learned which frequency traveled through walls. "Guests, use the door," he said softly. My wife covered her mouth to keep from making a sound. Mark's gaze slid slightly, as if tracking us both, and he added, almost gentle, "I'm right here. Just look at me." The cruelty of it was how reasonable it sounded, how much it mimicked what you say to calm someone down. My phone buzzed again. No police this time. I felt my stomach drop, because at the end of our street, the usual blue-red flicker wasn't coming. The neighborhood remained dark and quiet, streetlights steady, no approaching headlights, nothing. Either the police were slow, or he was right, or the call had never left the house the way we thought it did. My wife whispered that her phone screen had gone black, mid-call, like it had been muted. I watched Mark's face for a reaction. He smiled slightly wider, as if he'd felt the moment the line died. Then he did something that made my breath catch. He took one slow step forward. A single step. His boot sank into the snow, and when he lifted it, there was no print. The snow behind his foot smoothed itself, as if the ground didn't want to hold evidence. He took another step. No footprint. The motion box on my phone tracked him perfectly, yet the world beneath him refused to remember him. He stopped at the base of my back steps and looked up, head tilted. "You saw my garage," he said softly. "You saw how much I care." I felt my jaw lock, anger trying to ignite under fear. "Get off my property," I called, through the glass voice, loud enough that it echoed in the kitchen. Mark's eyes stayed fixed on me. "It's not your property at night," he replied calmly. "At night, it's all the same." Then his gaze flicked past me toward the hallway, toward the place where the basement door sat, and I realized he wasn't just staring for pleasure. He was checking alignment, confirming exits, watching our choices the way you watch a chessboard. My wife whispered, "Don't let him make you go downstairs," and I nodded, but my body was already responding to his attention like a conditioned animal wanting to do the opposite just to prove I still had agency. The back door handle rattled softly, not from Mark touching it. I could see his hands at his sides, but from inside, as if the lock mechanism had decided to practice. The deadbolt clicked once, then clicked back, testing. Mark watched my face, as if tasting my reaction. "See," he murmured. "You don't need keys when you have time." I backed away from the door and felt the house tighten around us, every wall suddenly thin. Mark lifted his hand again slow and pointed at our kitchen window, then pointed at his own eyes. Then he pointed to the streetlight above him, and for a second I didn't understand until the light flickered, once dimmed slightly, then returned like someone had tapped a switch. Mark wasn't just using the house. He was using the neighborhood. He looked up at the streetlight, as if acknowledging a friend, then looked back at me and whispered, "Watch." The snow behind him under the streetlight began to change, not in a dramatic way, but in the subtle way your brain hates because it feels like hallucination. A second dark shape appeared in the yard, just beyond Mark, standing perfectly still. The camera motion box snapped to it, labeled it as a person, but the image showed only a deeper patch of darkness. Then, a third shape closer to the fence. The motion boxes multiplied while my eyes saw almost nothing, and I realized the software was catching bodies my vision couldn't render. Mark's smile widened with quiet satisfaction, and he said, "They like you." My wife started to cry, a small broken sound she couldn't hold back, and the shapes in the snow seemed to lean forward by an inch, not stepping, just inclining, as if they responded to emotion the way dogs respond to scent. I felt my throat close because the horror had shifted from one obsessed neighbor to something else, something that used him as a doorway. Mark stood at the base of our steps, eyes still open, still unblinking, and he lifted his hand in a slow wave like the first night. Friendly and patient. "Come, be polite," he whispered. "Come, greet your neighbor." My phone buzzed with a final text. He never blinks. I stared at Mark's eyes and saw a sheen on them. Not tears, not moisture, but something like a reflection that didn't match the yard. For a fraction of a second in the glassy surface of his eyes, I saw our dining room from above the angle of a ceiling corner. Camera, our mattress, our bags, our hands clutching each other. His eyes weren't just eyes. They were screens. He was watching us, watching him, an endless loop that made my stomach roll. I stumbled back, and in that movement, my shoulder hit the wall switch. The kitchen light snapped off. In the darkness, Mark finally blinked once, slow, deliberate, and when his eyes opened again, the yard under the streetlight was empty. No Mark. No shapes. Nothing but fresh snow, as if the last 10 minutes had been erased. My phone still showed motion boxes for 2 seconds, hovering over emptiness. Then the boxes vanished too, like even the software had been corrected. My wife whispered, "Where did he go?" And I couldn't answer, because the silence felt staged, like a room after a door closes. Then, from directly behind us, from inside the house, a soft voice spoke near my ear in my own cadence, smooth and patient, the voice from the recorder. He looked. I spun flashlight up and saw Mark standing in our hallway barefoot, soil smeared on his feet, coat unbuttoned, eyes wide and dry, unblinking again. He smiled gently as if we'd finally followed instructions. "Good Mark," whispered, and for the first time his voice sounded pleased without hiding it. "Now you understand." My wife screamed, and the sound tore through the house like a flare. Mark didn't rush. He didn't lunge. He just stared at us with that calm, patient attention, and I realized the staring had never been the beginning of the horror. It was the method. He stared until you moved the way he wanted, until you proved which door you'd choose, until the house rearranged itself to make your choices feel inevitable. I backed toward the dining room, dragging my wife with me, and Mark's gaze followed with slow precision like a camera panning. "You can leave," he said, softly, gesturing toward the basement, with 2 fingers like a host offering a tour. "Guests, use the door." I felt something in me snap. Not bravery, not heroism, just the refusal to obey one more instruction, and I grabbed the metal plate we'd bolted over the mail slot earlier, still leaning against the wall after we'd replaced it, and I flung it at Mark's face with all the strength I had. The plate hit him with a dull thud. He didn't flinch. It didn't even leave a mark. It fell to the floor, and Mark's eyes never left mine. He smiled a little wider, and he whispered almost lovingly, "You're learning." The lights in the house flickered once, and for a heartbeat the hallway behind Mark, filled with dark shapes not fully visible, just the suggestion of bodies, standing close, crowding behind him like a family behind a patriarch. Then the lights steadied. Mark was alone again, still smiling, still staring, and my phone, forgotten on the dining room mattress, buzzed one last time with a notification that felt like the final punchline. Person detected. Home. The screen showed the camera view of our living room from a high corner angle we hadn't installed, and in that view a figure stood perfectly still under the ceiling light, facing the camera, wearing my hoodie, wearing my face on a taped photo. Mask standing in the exact posture Mark used when he stared into our window, as if the shrine had finally stepped out of the garage and into our house. The figure didn't move. It just watched. And in the quiet after my wife's scream, I heard the softest sound from the basement floor beneath us, the same rhythm that had haunted every attempt to run funk, drag, circling patiently under the house, waiting for us to choose a door